Beneath the quiet North Sea there may be no ruins, no towers, no written names, and yet a whole human landscape is missing from the map. People once moved across ground that is now water, following animals, rivers, seasons and shorelines that slowly withdrew from them. The cold truth is that human history did not only happen on land we can still stand on. Some of it was erased by the sea before memory could become record. What did we lose when that world disappeared? And how can an entire country lie beneath the North Sea? Beneath the North Sea, the story does not begin with a drowned city, or with a lost kingdom, or with some sudden punishment from the waves. It begins more quietly, with a map that no longer looks like itself. Today, when people imagine the North Sea, they usually picture open water between Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark and Norway. They picture ships, fishing grounds, wind, grey weather, and long lines of coast. But if we move backward in time, before the sea reached its present shape, that same space was not only water. Large areas that are now covered by the sea were once dry or partly wet land, changing over thousands of years as ice melted and the world warmed after the last ice age. This does not mean there was a country in the modern sense. There were no borders drawn on parchment, no capital, no written laws, no single flag, and no name preserved by its own people. The word country here is closer to a human landscape, a wide homeland of rivers, marshes, low hills, animals, paths, camps, and seasonal movements, a place where people could live without knowing that one day the ground itself would vanish from sight. This is why the title is powerful, but it must be handled carefully. An entire country beneath the North Sea is not a simple claim that a nation sank whole into the water. It is a way of pointing towards something colder, and perhaps more important. Human history is larger than the land that remains above the waves. Much of the beginning of our story happened before writing, before cities, before states, and before the maps that make the present world feel permanent. The people who moved through this lost landscape were not characters in a legend. They were human beings with bodies like ours, dependent on food, warmth, memory, tools, fire, other people, and the changing seasons. Their lives were tied to ground that has become almost impossible for us to imagine as ground. If they followed a river, that river may now be buried under marine sediment. If they crossed a plain, that plain may now lie below shipping lanes. If they returned to a familiar camp after many moons, the place itself may have changed slowly across generations until the shoreline moved closer. The wet ground spread farther, and the old routes became harder to use. The beginning of this story is therefore not the sea, but the human need to recognize place. From the earliest stages of our species, people survived by reading landscapes. They noticed where animals passed, where plants could be gathered, where fresh water might be found, where shelter was possible, and where danger increased. Long before history became a written record, the human brain was already carrying maps made of memory. Those maps were not drawn with ink. They were held in bodies, in habits, in repeated journeys, in the knowledge passed between older and younger people. Doggerland, the name often used for this lost region, matters because it reminds us that some of those remembered maps had no chance of becoming permanent. They were carried for a while, then weakened, then disappeared with the people who knew them. What remains now is not a complete story, but a set of traces. Scientists study the shape of the seabed, ancient river channels, layers of sediment, pollen, animal bones, and stone tools brought up from the seafloor or found along nearby coasts. These traces do not allow us to describe every village, every family, or every moment. They do something more modest and more reliable. They show that the North Sea was not always the barrier it appears to be today. It was once, in different phases, a changing space of land and water where humans and animals could move. For sleep, this thought can be held slowly. The present coastline is not the edge of all human memory. It is only the latest visible line. Beneath it lies an older geography, not silent because it never mattered, but silent because the sea covered the places where its ordinary days once happened. To understand the missing land beneath the North Sea, it helps to slow the mind and remove the modern map for a moment. The blue space between Britain and Northern Europe can feel fixed, as if it has always been water, as if Britain has always stood apart. But the deeper story asks us to imagine a world in which coastlines were temporary edges, not permanent borders. During the colder phases of the last ice age, Much of the world's water was locked in great ice sheets. Sea levels were lower than today, and parts of the continental shelf now underwater were exposed. In northwestern Europe, this meant that Britain was not always separated from the mainland by the same wide sea we see now. The land between them changed over time, sometimes open, sometimes wet, crossed by rivers, lakes, marshes and low plains. It was not a frozen picture, it was a moving landscape, shaped by climate, ice, water, plants, animals and time. The people who lived within that world did not experience it as a scientific reconstruction. They experienced it through their feet, hunger, need for shelter, and memory of useful places. A river was not an item on a map. It was a route, a drinking place, a place where animals might gather, a boundary that could be followed, crossed, or avoided. A rise in the ground was not a contour line. It was a dry place in wet weather, a lookout, a possible camp, or a familiar shape on the horizon. When we speak about land now beneath the North Sea, we are speaking about the loss of these practical relationships between bodies and place. Human beings began as animals who had to read the world closely. Survival depended on noticing small differences in ground, weather, sound, and movement. In that sense, the first human maps were not made for owning land. They were made for staying alive. The ancient landscapes now hidden offshore were part of that deeper beginning. Not the beginning of civilization, but the older beginning of orientation, memory, and movement. The North Sea today can make those beginnings feel distant because water hides scale. A ship passing over a buried river channel does not show the walker who once might have followed it. A fishing net catching a bone or a worked flint does not reveal the full season in which it was used. Yet these small remains pull the mind back toward a different Europe, one in which the distance between land masses was not always measured by sea crossings. The vanished ground may have allowed movement for animals and people across areas later separated. This does not mean there was one simple migration path or one dramatic escape from a sinking world. The safer picture is slower and more uneven. Some places became wetter, some routes changed. Some areas may have remained useful, while others were lost gradually as the sea rose and the coast shifted. For people living then, change may have appeared as local problems rather than one giant event. A camp too close to water, a marsh spreading farther than before, a hunting route becoming difficult, a river mouth changing shape, a shoreline that older people remembered differently. Across generations, such changes could turn a lived homeland into seabed. This is why the idea of a whole country beneath the North Sea is not only about geology. It is about the connection between human memory and stable ground. Written history teaches us to expect names, dates, rulers, and walls. But the older human past often gives us none of these. It gives us landscapes, tools, bones, sediments, and patterns of movement. It asks us to accept that many lives were real even when they left no sentence behind. The missing map under the water is not empty. It is filled with absence, and that absence has a shape. The most difficult thing to imagine about a lost landscape is not its disappearance, but its ordinariness. If a person today stands on the coast of eastern England or looks out from the shores of the Netherlands or Denmark, the North Sea seems like a finished fact. Water fills the view. The horizon gives no sign of paths, rivers, animal trails, wooded edges, or dry ground. Yet the buried story asks us to look at that water as a cover placed over an older surface. Not a cover placed suddenly everywhere, and not a cover hiding a single dramatic secret, but a cover built slowly from melting ice, rising seas, shifting sediments, and time. In that older world, the space now separating Britain from continental Europe could have been experienced as a lived environment rather than a boundary. People may have moved through it without thinking of themselves as crossing between nations, because nations did not yet exist. They were moving through weather, through seasons, through the needs of the body, and through a geography that offered food in some places and danger in others. The idea of an entire country beneath the North Sea becomes clearer when we stop looking for castles and start looking for conditions of life. A country, in the oldest human sense, can be a place large enough to hold repeated journeys. It can be a remembered river bend, a line of higher ground, a place where animals returned, a stretch of wetland that gave birds, fish, reeds, or shelter. a dry route between colder open land and safer campsites. These are not spectacular remains. They are the quiet foundations of survival. For most of human existence, people did not leave behind monuments that could speak loudly to later ages. They left behind stone edges shaped by hand, cut marks on bone, traces of fire when preservation allowed it, and patterns in the land that only patient study can begin to recover. This is where the story remains honest. We cannot describe the full daily life of the people who passed through Doggerland as if we had watched them. We cannot know their private fears, their exact beliefs, or the names they may have used for rivers and places. What can be said more safely is that humans were present in northwestern Europe during periods when the geography was very different from today, and that the now submerged land would have formed part of the wider world through which people and animals could move. That is already enough to change the way the mind sees the sea. It turns open water into a missing page. The beginning of our species was not a straight path toward farming, cities, and written history. It was a long dependence on living landscapes. Human bodies evolved to move, notice, remember, cooperate, and adapt. A person crossing wet ground had to feel texture beneath the feet. A group following animals had to understand distance and return. Children learned from older people not through books, but through repeated presence in places that mattered. When those places changed, knowledge had to change with them. A rising sea does not only take land. It can weaken old roots, divide familiar territories, and make inherited knowledge less reliable. Over many generations, a path that once connected people could become a marsh, then a tidal flat, then open water. A place remembered by grandparents might become unreachable to grandchildren. No single moment needs to explain the whole loss. The quieter truth is that human worlds can end gradually until the people inside them may not see an ending, only a series of necessary adjustments. This is why the North Sea is not merely a setting for the story. It is the evidence of a larger principle. The Earth has never been a still stage on which human history simply unfolds. The stage itself moves. Ice advances and retreats. Rivers alter their courses. Coasts migrate. Shelves become seas. In the case of Doggerland, the movement of the Earth's systems overlapped with the fragile beginning of human memory in that region. The people who lived there were not outside nature, observing it from a safe distance. They were inside it, as all humans are. Their choices, routes, diets, and meetings depended on the shape of a world that did not promise to remain. When we ask how an entire country can lie beneath the North Sea, we are really asking how much of human history has no visible shoreline left to defend it. The answer cannot be simple, because the lost world itself was not simple. It was not a single city drowned in one night. It was a changing human landscape gradually hidden by the sea, leaving behind enough traces to remind us that the map we know is only the latest version of a much older Earth. Before the North Sea took on its familiar shape, Northern Europe belonged to a colder rhythm. Ice did not simply sit in the background as scenery. It held water, pressed down land, changed winds, guided rivers, and helped decide where plants, animals, and people could live. During the colder phases of the last ice age, vast ice sheets covered large parts of the north. Much water that would otherwise have filled the oceans was locked away as ice on land. Because of that, sea levels were lower than they are today, and the shallow continental shelf between Britain and mainland Europe was exposed in ways that are now difficult to picture. The modern sea hides this fact because water makes the present look natural and complete, but the present is only one arrangement in a longer sequence. When the climate warmed and the ice began to melt, the world did not change all at once. The sea rose over long spans of time, unevenly, and the land responded in different ways. Some areas became wetter before they became fully submerged. Some valleys filled, some rivers changed their lower courses, some dry passages narrowed. In a place like the southern North Sea basin, small differences in height could matter greatly, because much of the land was low. A gentle rise could remain useful when nearby ground turned marshy. A river edge could become a shifting boundary between dry travel and wet difficulty. For people living in such a world, climate change was not an abstract idea. It was the slow alteration of places that fed them, guided them, and held their memory. The human body was never separate from this changing map. A person walking through late Ice Age and early post-Ice Age landscapes had to know where the ground could bear weight, where fresh water could be found, where animals might pass, and where wind or cold made stopping dangerous. The beginning of human history, long before written records, was deeply physical in this way. It was not made first from dates and names. It was made from movement, hunger, warmth, fatigue, and recognition. When people learned a landscape, they learned it through repeated use. They carried its shape inside them as remembered routes and expected returns. The land beneath the North Sea matters because some of those early human maps were built on ground that did not remain. As the ice withdrew and the climate shifted, plants spread into areas that had once been too cold or too open for them. Animals followed changing habitats. Humans followed possibilities, not a fixed plan. The region now associated with Doggerland would have changed many times, and it should not be imagined as one stable paradise suddenly destroyed. At different moments it may have included open plains, river valleys, wetlands, lakes, wooded areas, and coastlines that moved as the sea advanced. This is one of the quiet challenges of telling the story honestly. A modern viewer may want a single lost place with a single image, a green land, a sudden flood, a final day. The evidence points instead to a long transformation. The land was part of a wider ecological system, and that system changed as the planet moved out of the Ice Age. People did not stand outside that system with knowledge of the future. They lived inside its local details. A place that was good for gathering, hunting, fishing, or resting in one generation might become less reliable in another. A route that linked groups across open country might become a chain of wet crossings, then a coastal edge, then a memory with no path left. Britain's later separateness was not built into the world from the beginning. It emerged through these slow changes. The water that now divides island and continent arrived over a landscape where humans and animals had once been able to move in ways that are no longer possible. This does not mean every movement was easy, or that the whole region was always dry, or that people occupied every part of it continuously. It means the boundary we see today was not the boundary ancient people always knew. If we want to understand how a country can lie beneath the North Sea, we must first understand that the sea itself has a history. Its floor is not just the bottom of water. It is the former surface of a world shaped by ice, warming, rivers, mud, plants, animals, and human passage. The lost land was not removed from history because it was unreal. It became difficult to remember because the shape of the earth changed around it. As the ice sheets weakened, the land did not simply wait to be covered. It answered in many quiet ways. Ground that had been pressed by heavy ice could rise again after the weight was removed, while other low regions were more exposed to the returning sea. Rivers carried meltwater, sediment, and the broken memory of colder landscapes toward lower basins. Valleys that once guided animals and people began to change their meaning. A river could become broader, a lake could grow, a marsh could spread over ground that had once been firm enough to cross. In the southern North Sea world, where much of the exposed shelf was low, the difference between land and water may sometimes have been small enough to change the use of a place without erasing it immediately. This is important because disappearance rarely begins as disappearance. It begins as inconvenience, then uncertainty, then distance. A familiar route becomes wetter underfoot. A dry camp becomes less dependable after storms. A place where animals gathered shifts toward another edge of the landscape. The people living through such changes did not need to understand global sea level to notice that the world around them was no longer quite the same. Their knowledge was local, practical, and carried in the body. They knew the feel of ground, the direction of wind, the behavior of animals, the taste of fresh water, the difficulty of moving children, tools, food, and fire across a changing place. The story of the land beneath the North Sea is therefore not only a story of water rising upward, it is also a story of human attention being forced to adjust. Long before farming villages, writing, or permanent borders, people depended on remembered landscapes as a living form of intelligence. The human brain did not evolve for abstract maps first. It evolved in moving bodies that had to find their way back, avoid danger, recognize seasonal returns, and share useful knowledge. A child learning where to walk, where not to step, where birds gathered, or where older people expected game to pass was learning history in its earliest form. That history was not written down, but it was real. It lived in repetition. In a world like Doggerland, repetition would have been tested by water. Every generation might inherit a map that was slightly less complete than the one before, not because the elders were wrong, but because the ground itself had changed. This is one of the coldest ideas in the whole subject. Human beings can preserve memory only as long as the world still gives that memory a place to attach itself. When the place is altered beyond recognition, memory becomes thinner. A path can survive in speech for a while. A river name can survive if people continue to live near it. But in deep prehistory, where no writing fixed those names, the loss of a root could mean the loss of an entire chain of remembered meaning. The sea did not need to destroy stone walls to erase a human world. It only needed to cover the ordinary places where knowledge was used. The transformation after the Ice Age also changed the wider relationship between Britain and mainland Europe. What later generations would see as a sea crossing had once been, in some periods and places, part of a broader connected landscape. This connection was never simple. There were rivers, wetlands, changing coastlines and difficult ground, but it allowed possibilities that the later sea would reduce. Animals could move across wider ranges. Human groups could follow resources through areas that are now offshore. Contacts, routes and repeated seasonal movements may have linked lands that now feel separate. The modern island shape of Britain came out of this long process, not from a single clean cut. That matters because human history is often told from the viewpoint of present borders. We begin with the map we know, then imagine the past inside it. Doggerland asks us to reverse that habit. It asks us to begin with a world before the familiar borders, before the water drew the lines we now take for granted. Under the North Sea lies evidence that geography itself has a biography. The seabed is not empty space between countries. It is a buried archive of older surfaces, older rivers, older habitats, and human passages that belong to a different arrangement of the earth. To understand that archive, we have to hold two truths together. The land was real, and yet it was never fixed. It supported life, and yet it was already changing. It connected places, and yet it was slowly becoming a boundary. That slow turning of land into sea is the doorway into the deeper question. How much of the beginning of human life in this region happened on ground that can no longer be walked? The shape of the North Sea can make the past feel as if it has been sealed away completely, but the deeper story is not sealed. It is only difficult to read. Beneath the waves, the seabed still holds forms that belong to an older world. Buried channels where rivers once moved, layers of sediment laid down under different conditions, and traces of plants and animals that speak of changing climates. These are not the remains of a single lost city, they are the remains of a landscape. To understand them, we have to think less like someone searching for a monument, and more like someone listening for a faint pattern underwater. The story after the Ice Age was not a clean movement from land to sea. It was a long passage through many intermediate worlds. There were times when low ground may have been dry enough for movement, times when it became wet and uncertain, times when fresh water and salt water met in shifting margins, and times when the coast itself moved farther inland. For people living within this changing region, the world would not have announced that a great transformation was happening. There may have been no single line that said the old land was ending and the new sea was beginning. Instead, there were practical changes. The distance to dry ground lengthened. The route around water became harder. The animals that once followed certain paths shifted their habits. A place useful in one season might fail in another. Human life in such a setting depended on careful attention, because the body had to answer the land before the mind could turn it into a story. Feet felt soft ground before anyone named it dangerous. Hands gathered fuel before anyone imagined a future coastline. Eyes followed birds, deer, fish, weather and smoke, not because these things were symbols, but because they mattered for survival. This is where the lost land beneath the North Sea touches the beginning of human experience. Before history became a record of rulers and dates, it was a record held in movement. People knew the world by travelling through it. They learned where water could be trusted, where shelter could be found, where a group might rest, where children could be kept safe, and where food might return with the season. In a stable landscape, such knowledge could be strengthened across generations. In a changing landscape, it had to be revised again and again. The warming after the Ice Age did not only raise the sea, it asked human memory to keep adjusting to a ground that would not stay still. This does not mean people were helpless, or that every change was sudden disaster. Humans are flexible animals. Much of our success comes from being able to move, learn, cooperate, and use old knowledge in new circumstances. But flexibility has limits when the physical world itself is being rearranged. A route can be replaced if another route exists. A camp can be moved if there is another dry place nearby. A food source can be supplemented if other resources remain available. Yet as sea level continued to rise, the larger pattern was toward reduction. The broad space between Britain and the continent narrowed in its usefulness. Some areas became islands of higher ground. Some edges became coasts. Some former interiors became margins. Over long periods, what had once connected places began to separate them. This is why the modern North Sea is not just water on a map. It is the result of a long negotiation between climate, ice, land and ocean. That negotiation happened while human groups were still living by direct dependence on their surroundings. They did not have written archives to preserve what each place had been. They did not have national histories to mark the transformation. Their world was remembered in use. When use became impossible, memory had less ground to stand on. The lost landscape, often called Doggerland, therefore sits at a quiet boundary between geology and human life. Geology tells us seas rise, rivers shift, sediments accumulate, and coastlines migrate. Human life tells us that places are not empty surfaces. They become meaningful because bodies return to them, because groups learn them, because children grow up within their patterns, and because survival depends on recognizing them. When that kind of place disappears, something more than land is removed. A way of knowing the world is also weakened. We should not imagine this as a single tragic moment watched by silent crowds from a hill. That would be too simple, and perhaps too theatrical for what the evidence can support. The more careful image is slower. Many years, many shorelines, many decisions, many small abandonments. A crossing no longer worth the risk. A wetland too difficult to pass. A camp left unused. A familiar direction becoming water. Gradually, the landscape that had helped shape memory became a landscape only the seabed could keep. In this sense, the question of an entire country beneath the North Sea is really a question about time. The country was not a state. It was not a nation. It was a human world made of repeated contact with land. The sea did not need to erase its name, because no written name had survived. It only needed to cover the places where life had once returned, season after season, until the map of the present became calm enough to hide the map before it. Doggerland is sometimes pulled toward fantasy because the image is so strong. A vanished land under a grey northern sea. The mind easily turns it into an Atlantis of the Ice Age, a hidden civilization, a drowned kingdom, a place of towers and secrets. But that is not the careful story. The careful story is quieter, and in many ways more powerful. Doggerland was not a mythical city. It was not a known empire. It was not a nation that fell in a single night. It was a changing prehistoric landscape, known today through geology, archaeology, and environmental evidence, rather than through names, monuments, or writing. This matters because the truth of the place does not need decoration. The real loss is already large enough. Beneath the North Sea there were once surfaces where rivers moved, animals passed, plants grew, and human beings may have travelled, paused, hunted, gathered, and learned the world through direct experience. To call it a lost country is useful only if we remember what kind of country it was. Not a political country, but a lived one. A country of ground underfoot, a country of roots, a country of seasons. A country that existed before anyone could leave behind a written account saying, "This is where we are from." The evidence for such a world is not built from legend. It comes from the seabed itself, from the shape of submerged channels, from sediment cores, from pollen and plant remains, from animal bones, and from stone tools found in contexts linked to the broader drowned landscape. Each kind of evidence is modest on its own. A flint tool does not tell a full life story. A pollen grain does not show a person walking. A buried river channel does not name the people who crossed near it, but together they allow a cautious reconstruction of a vanished environment. They show that the North Sea floor was not always the bottom of a sea. It has passed through other states. It has held fresh water, dry ground, wetlands, river systems, and coastlines in different phases. The human beginning in such a world must be understood with patience. People in deep prehistory did not live in the kind of record that later civilizations left behind. They lived in movement and use. A place mattered because it could be crossed, because it held food, because it offered shelter, because it was known by older people, because it could be reached again. The fact that much of this place is now underwater makes it easy to underestimate. Modern history often values what remains visible: buildings, roads, inscriptions, walls. But the older human past often has no walls. It survives through traces small enough to be missed, and through landscapes that must be inferred rather than seen. That is why Doggerland should not be presented as a sensational mystery waiting for one dramatic solution. It is better understood as a missing chapter in the geography of human life. The danger of comparing it too quickly to Atlantis is that Atlantis is a story about sudden destruction, moral drama, and a lost advanced place. Doggerland is different. Its importance lies not in impossible grandeur, but in ordinary dependence. The people who passed through that region, when conditions allowed, would have been concerned with the same basic pressures that shaped human life for most of our existence: food, warmth, distance, weather, tools, cooperation, children, fatigue, and the memory of safe places. None of that is less meaningful because it left no palace. In fact, it may be more closely tied to the long foundation of our species. Before humans built cities, they built familiarity with landscapes. Before they wrote histories, they carried histories in roots. Before they marked borders, they recognized useful places through repeated return. The drowned world beneath the North Sea reminds us that the earliest human story is not only a story of invention, it is also a story of attachment to environments that could change beyond recognition. To be honest about Doggerland means accepting both presence and uncertainty. We can say that the physical landscape existed in forms very different from today. We can say that humans lived in and moved through northwestern Europe during relevant periods. We can say that the exposed and later flooding land would have formed part of the wider ecological setting available to animals and people. But we should not pretend to know every settlement pattern, every belief, or every personal experience. The seabed gives evidence, not complete memory. It invites reconstruction, not fantasy. This restraint does not weaken the story, it deepens it. A false story may feel bright for a moment, but a careful story lasts longer because it leaves room for what is still unknown. Under the North Sea, the past is not asking to become a legend. It is asking to be recognised as part of the real human beginning, a world where land, water, climate, and memory were bound together before writing could protect any name from being lost. The strongest evidence for a drowned prehistoric landscape is often not dramatic to the eye. It may be a dark layer of ancient mud, a small piece of worked flint, a preserved fragment of bone, a pattern in the seabed, or pollen sealed inside sediment long after the plants themselves disappeared. These things do not look like the ruins people expect when they hear about a lost country. They do not rise from the water like walls. They do not give us carved names or clear scenes of daily life. Yet they are the kind of evidence that can speak honestly about a place older than writing. Doggerland is known through this quieter language. Its reality depends not on a legend being repeated, but on many different traces pointing toward the same larger fact. The southern North Sea was once a shifting environment of land, rivers, wetlands, and coastlines before it became the sea we know today. The seabed preserves hints of ancient river systems because water leaves shape behind. Rivers cut channels. Lakes gather sediments. Marshes trap organic remains. Wind, ice, and flowing water arrange the ground in ways that can remain detectable even after the sea covers them. When scientists study those forms, they are not inventing a story from emptiness. They are reading physical patterns left by earlier environments. A buried channel can show that water once moved across exposed ground. Sediment can reveal whether an area was once freshwater, brackish, marine, dry, or wet. Pollen can suggest what kinds of plants were present nearby. Animal bones can point toward the wider ecology of the region. Stone tools, when securely understood, bring human hands into the picture. None of these traces is complete by itself, but together they form a careful outline. That outline is not a fantasy country. It is a real but incomplete landscape, reconstructed from what survived. This is important for the human story because most early human lives were not designed to leave permanent signs. For a very long time, human beings lived without architecture strong enough to resist deep time, without writing, and often without durable objects beyond stone, bone, antler, and occasional preserved organic materials. Their most important knowledge may have been stored in ways that do not fossilize: speech, gesture, memory, skill, habit, and attention to place. A person could know exactly where to find fresh water after a dry season, but that knowledge might leave no mark unless an object was lost, or a layer of soil happened to preserve some trace. A group could return to a useful place many times, and still leave only a few scattered signs. When that place later became seabed, the already fragile record became even harder to read. The North Sea did not only cover land, it covered the context that would have helped us understand each small object. A stone tool brought up from the seabed may suggest human activity, but without its original setting fully preserved, it cannot tell us everything about who used it, how often people came there, or what the place meant to them. This is why careful language matters. It protects the story from becoming larger than the evidence. Doggerland can be described as a significant lost landscape, but not as a documented kingdom. It can be connected to human movement and habitation in prehistoric northwestern Europe, but not turned into a detailed society whose beliefs, stories, and names we can confidently narrate. The more honest image is one of partial visibility. A coastline appears, then fades. A river system becomes visible through mapping, but its human meanings remain largely unknown. A tool shows a human hand, but not a complete biography. A bone shows an animal presence, but not every hunt or every season. This partial visibility is not a weakness. It is exactly how deep prehistory often reaches us. The beginning of human life in such regions was not recorded by people who expected distant audiences. It was lived in immediate needs. Bodies moved through weather, hands shaped tools, eyes followed animals and water. Older knowledge guided younger bodies across ground that felt familiar because it had been used before. If the ground changed, the knowledge had to change. If the ground disappeared, the knowledge could only survive by being carried elsewhere, and even then it would lose some of its attachment to place. The great lesson of the evidence is that a landscape can be real even when it leaves no monument. It can shape generations without producing a single written sentence. It can connect regions, hold resources, and guide movement, then vanish beneath water so completely that later people assume the sea was always there. The work of science is not to turn that vanished world into a bedtime myth, but to give it back a careful outline. In that outline, there is room for uncertainty, and that uncertainty is part of the truth. We can imagine the land slowly, not as a perfect picture, but as a set of conditions: low ground, waterways, wet margins, animals, changing vegetation, and human passage through a world that did not know it would one day become the floor of the North Sea. A careful story about Doggerland must end its first correction here. The wonder is not that a magnificent civilization was lost, but that an ordinary human world can disappear so completely that later people need instruments, cores, maps, and patient comparison to believe it was ever there. This changes the mood of the North Sea. It is no longer only a stretch of water between modern countries. It becomes a deep archive with most of its pages damaged, scattered, or sealed under sediment. The archive does not speak in a single voice. It offers shapes, fragments, chemical traces, ancient plant evidence, animal remains, and occasional objects shaped by human hands. From these, scientists build cautious pictures of changing land, and those pictures are revised when better evidence appears. That is why certainty must remain limited. Doggerland was real as a changing physical landscape, but the details of its human life are still partly hidden. We can say that people in prehistoric northwestern Europe lived close to animal movements, fresh water, raw materials, weather, and seasonal change. We can say that land now beneath the North Sea would have belonged to the wider world available to them at different times. We can say that rising seas gradually transformed that world, but we cannot turn every empty space in the evidence into a village, a belief, a memory, or a dramatic last day. The older human past deserves more respect than that. Its power lies in how little it needed to be meaningful. A temporary camp could matter. A river crossing could matter. A patch of higher ground in a wet landscape could matter. A place where people returned again and again, even without buildings, could become part of their inherited knowledge. Much of what made such places valuable was carried in bodies rather than objects. The hand knew how a tool should feel. The feet knew which ground was safer after rain. The eye recognized the movement of animals. The ear noticed weather, birds, water, or the approach of others. Human beings came from this long education in landscapes. Before written history, before kingdoms, before any fixed border between island and continent, survival depended on attention to place. Doggerland matters because it shows how vulnerable that attention can be when the place itself changes beyond return. The sea did not have to erase a grand capital to erase a world. It only had to cover river edges, campsites, pathways, feeding grounds, and the small repeated locations where knowledge became useful. Over time, those losses could reshape how people moved through northwestern Europe. A connection that once seemed practical could become difficult. A crossing that once belonged to land could become a journey by water. A familiar direction could become an edge. This is the real meaning behind rejecting the Atlantis image. The false version makes the story smaller, because it asks us to care only if there were palaces, secrets, or sudden catastrophe. The truer version is broader. It asks us to care about landscapes that supported ordinary human life before anyone wrote them down. It asks us to understand that the human beginning was not waiting for cities to become important. It was already important when people were learning rivers, following animals, shaping stone, sharing food, carrying children, and remembering where the ground had once been reliable. In this sense, Doggerland is not a myth beneath the waves, but a reminder that many real human worlds were never protected by names. They existed through use. They faded through environmental change. They survive now only where mud, bone, stone, pollen, and seabed shape have kept a faint record. To listen to that record honestly is to accept incompleteness. The missing land under the North Sea cannot give us all its voices. It can only show that the present sea is not the beginning of the story, and that beneath its quiet surface lies an older geography where human life once had room to move. A low world of rivers, marshes, open ground, and changing edges is harder to imagine than a dramatic ruin, because it has no single shape that can be held in the mind. Doggerland was not one scene. It was a landscape that changed as climate changed, as water moved, as plants spread, and as animals followed the conditions they needed. At some times, parts of it may have been open and cold, with wide views and sparse cover. At other times, as the world warmed after the Ice Age, more vegetation would have spread into suitable places, and the balance between dry ground, wetlands, lakes, rivers, and coastlines would have shifted. The safest way to picture it is not as a perfect green land, and not as a frozen wasteland, but as a living margin between many states of the earth. It was low, vulnerable, and useful. Its value came from water and land being close together. Rivers could guide movement. Wetlands could hold birds, fish, reeds, insects, and other life. Higher ground could offer drier passage. Edges between habitats often attract animals, and animals mattered deeply to human survival. For people moving through such a place, the landscape was not scenery, it was a set of possibilities and limits. A river might be a path, but also an obstacle. A marsh might offer resources, but also slow travel. Open ground might make movement easier, but also expose bodies to wind and cold. Woodland might give shelter and fuel, but also reduce visibility. The human beginning was shaped in exactly these kinds of negotiations. Our ancestors did not live in nature as an idea. They lived in specific places, with specific ground beneath their feet, and their knowledge had to match the place closely enough to keep them alive. In a world like Doggerland, knowing the landscape would have meant knowing change. A wet season could alter a route. A storm could reshape a shore, a river could flood low ground. A place good for resting in one period might become difficult later. The people who used this landscape would not have needed a modern scientific language to understand that some places were dependable and others were risky. Their bodies would have learned it through use. Cold air, damp clothing, soft mud, sharp stone, tired legs, hunger, thirst, and the need to protect children would have made the land real in ways no map can fully show. This is where the buried North Sea becomes more than geology. It becomes a reminder that early human life was built from close attention to environments that were never guaranteed to last. If animals moved through the region, humans may have followed them where conditions made that possible. If fish, shellfish, birds, plants, or freshwater resources were available in certain places, those places could become important without ever becoming permanent settlements in the later sense. A group did not need stone walls to have a relationship with a landscape. Repeated return was enough. The same bend in a river, the same higher place near wet ground, the same crossing, the same sheltered edge could become part of lived memory. Yet because Doggerland was low and changing, those remembered places were especially exposed to time. A river valley that once gathered life could become an estuary, a marsh could widen, a lake edge could shift. A coastal strip could be eaten away or drowned as the sea advanced. The result was not simply the loss of empty land. It was the loss of a mixed environment where many forms of life met, and where human beings may have found food, movement, and orientation. The animals of this wider world would have changed across time as climate and vegetation changed. It is safer to speak in broad ecological terms than to pretend that one exact list fits every period. Large mammals, smaller animals, fish, birds, and plant resources would all have mattered differently depending on the local setting and the era. What matters for the story is that Doggerland sat within a changing web of life. Humans were one species inside that web, intelligent and flexible, but still dependent on the same basic realities as any animal body: energy, warmth, water, rest, protection, and the ability to find the next place where life could continue. When we imagine the North Sea floor as former land, we should not imagine only dry plains. We should imagine gradients: dry to wet, fresh to salty, open to wooded, safe to dangerous, familiar to uncertain. These gradients are where human knowledge becomes detailed. A person might not need to understand a whole region to survive. They needed to understand the next stretch of ground, the next source of water, the next expected return of animals, the next safer place to stop. Across generations, such knowledge could become deep, but not permanent. The sea slowly changed the conditions under which memory worked. A useful wetland could become too wet. A river crossing could become a tidal place. A path could be interrupted. A hunting ground could move with the animals. In this way, the land beneath the North Sea was not merely swallowed after being complete. It was transformed while it was being lived in. That is the quiet force of the story. Doggerland was a human landscape because it offered the things human bodies needed, but it was also a fragile landscape because its very richness came from edges that could shift. The rivers, marshes, low plains, and changing shores gave life room to gather, and then, over time, gave the sea room to enter. The richness of a place like Doggerland would have come from its mixtures. A simple landscape gives fewer choices. A mixed landscape, where river, marsh, dry rise, woodland, open ground, lake edge, and coast all meet within reach of one another, can hold many kinds of life. This does not mean it was easy. Rich places can also be difficult places. Wet ground can preserve food, but it can also slow the body. A river can bring fish, birds, animals, and fresh water, but it can also block movement or become dangerous after rain and meltwater. A forest edge can offer fuel and shelter, but it can hide distance. Open ground can make travel clearer, but it can leave people exposed to cold wind. For human beings living before written history, such conditions would not have been understood as scenery. They would have been felt as a pattern of effort. Every choice of direction carried a cost. Every useful place had to be weighed against hunger, weather, fatigue, and the needs of others. This is why the drowned land beneath the North Sea matters so deeply to the question of human origins. It reminds us that our species did not begin by mastering nature from above. We began by learning how to live inside shifting conditions, using attention as carefully as any tool. The body itself was part of that knowledge. Eyes searched for movement at the edge of vision. Ears listened for water, birds, wind, animals or other people. Hands tested materials. Feet learned which ground could be trusted. Memory joined these sensations together until a place became familiar. In a low landscape, familiarity could be especially important, because small differences mattered. A slightly higher rise might stay dry when lower ground turned soft. A certain bend in a river might offer a crossing in one season, but not another. A patch of reeds might signal wet ground, nesting birds, or a useful material. A line of trees might mark shelter, fuel, or a route that could be followed when visibility was poor. None of these details would leave a clear sentence for us to read thousands of years later, yet they could decide whether a group moved safely, found food, or avoided unnecessary danger. When we look at the North Sea today, the water hides not only landforms but also this lost intimacy between bodies and ground. The ancient environment would not have stayed the same from one human lifetime to the next. As the climate warmed and the sea slowly advanced, the balance between habitats changed. Freshwater zones could become more influenced by saltwater. Dry ground could become damp margin. A river valley could become an estuary. A familiar lake edge could shift. Animals that used one area might move elsewhere as vegetation, water, and temperature changed. Human groups, flexible as they were, would have had to respond to these changes. They may have followed resources, altered routes, returned less often to places that became unreliable, or found new patterns of movement. It is important not to imagine this as a neat plan. People in deep prehistory did not see a long scientific graph of sea level rising. They saw local signs, water where it had not been so often before, ground that held footprints differently, fish or birds appearing in new places, a path taking longer, a camp becoming less useful, an older memory needing correction. Across generations, those small corrections could change the shape of a human world. The ecological edges of Doggerland would have made it valuable, but they also made it vulnerable. Edges are productive because different forms of life meet there. They are vulnerable because they can move. A coast is an edge that can shift inland. A marsh is an edge that can widen. A river mouth is an edge that can change its course and chemistry. For animals and humans alike, these edges could offer food and passage, but they did not promise permanence. This is one reason the idea of a country under the North Sea must be understood with care. It was not a country held together by stone roads or written law. It was a country of usable relationships between living beings and place. Its borders were not lines drawn by authority. They were conditions, where the ground stayed dry, where water could be crossed, where plants grew, where animals returned, where people remembered how to move. When those conditions changed, the country changed with them. For early humans, place was never just location. It was a practical memory system. To know a place was to know what it might give, what it might demand, and when it might become dangerous. A child growing within such a world would learn not by reading a map, but by repeating movements with others. The child would learn where to step, when to wait, what to watch, and how older people behaved when the weather shifted or the ground became uncertain. That kind of learning reaches back toward the deepest foundation of human life. We are a species that survives not only because of strong bodies or sharp tools, but because we share attention across time. Doggerland, now hidden beneath the sea, once belonged to that shared attention. Its rivers, marshes, and low plains were not background, they were teachers. They taught movement, caution, memory, and adaptation. And when the sea entered more and more of that world, it did not simply remove a piece of geography. It removed a field of learning where generations had once understood how to continue. A landscape of rivers and marshes is never only wet or dry. It is a world of thresholds. One step may be firm, the next uncertain. One season may open a route, another may close it. A place that feeds birds and fish may also slow a tired body. A line of higher ground may become precious not because it is grand, but because it stays above water when everything around it softens. Doggerland, as a lost region beneath the North Sea, should be held in the mind through these thresholds. It was not a single stable picture. It was a changing field of small differences that would have mattered greatly to any human group moving through it. In such a place, survival would depend less on owning territory than on understanding use. Where could people cross without wasting strength? Where could they stop without being exposed to wind? Where might animals gather? Where could fresh water still be found? Where did the ground change after rain, flood, thaw, or tide? These are practical questions, and they reach back toward the oldest human relationship with the earth. Long before people wrote laws or built permanent towns, they lived by reading conditions. The body was the first measuring instrument. Feet judged firmness. Skin felt cold and damp. Eyes followed the color of water, the movement of birds, the shape of trees, the track of animals, and the distance to shelter. In a low world like Doggerland, this kind of attention would not have been optional. It would have been woven into daily life. The same richness that made the landscape useful also made it difficult to hold still in memory. Rivers move, marshes spread, lakes rise or shrink, coasts shift, fresh water becomes mixed with salt, plants change with climate, animals alter their routes. For people, each change could require a new habit. A crossing once trusted might become dangerous. A camp once dry might become damp too often. A food source once reliable might appear in another place or season. These changes need not have felt like the end of a world all at once. They may have appeared as a series of adjustments. A group returns and chooses a slightly higher place. A route bends around new wet ground. The place used by older people is visited less often. A child grows up knowing a smaller version of the landscape than the one remembered by elders. Over generations, the difference becomes large. The human mind can carry a path for a while after the path has changed, but it cannot keep walking it if the sea has taken the ground away. This is where the environment of Doggerland becomes central to the title's question. An entire country can lie beneath the North Sea not because a nation sank with all its monuments, but because a whole system of usable places was gradually removed from human life. The country was made of relationships between people and rivers, people and animals, people and seasons, people and dry ground, people and memory. When those relationships were broken by rising water and shifting coasts, the loss was real, even if no stone city was left behind. Modern eyes often look for proof in large objects, but early human worlds were often held together by things that rarely survive. Habits, roots, warnings, stories told beside fire, gestures toward a distant rise, remembered places where food might be found. The seabed cannot preserve all of that. It can preserve the landforms, the sediments, the pollen, some bones, some tools, and the broad shape of environmental change. It can show that the present sea was once something else. It cannot return the full human knowledge that once belonged to that ground. This is why the lost landscape must be imagined with humility. The people who moved through northwestern Europe during these times were not primitive shadows waiting for history to begin. They were human beings living inside history before writing could hold it. Their world was made of decisions that had to be correct often enough for children to survive, for groups to keep moving, for tools to be carried, for food to be shared, and for memory to remain useful. A marsh, a river, or a low plain was not simply a background to that life. It shaped the scale of movement, the rhythm of return, and the limits of safety. If Doggerland offered many resources, it also demanded close attention. If it connected Britain and the continent in earlier phases, it also contained barriers of water and wet ground. If it felt familiar to those who used it, it was still vulnerable to forces beyond any human control. The slow entrance of the sea transformed this living margin into a hidden archive. What had once been a route became a channel underwater. What had once been a dry rise became a shoal or a buried surface. What had once helped people orient themselves became invisible from above. The modern North Sea covers that complexity with a single colour on the map, but below that colour lies a more patient truth. Human life often begins not in places that last forever, but in places that are temporary, changing, and deeply known while they remain. Doggerland teaches that a landscape does not need to be permanent to be meaningful. It only needs to have held life, memory, movement, and return before the water came in. The human body is often the quietest evidence in a story like this, because it leaves fewer traces than stone, bone, or sediment, yet everything about a lost landscape passed through bodies first. Doggerland was not experienced as a map under the North Sea. It was experienced as walking, carrying, waiting, listening, feeling cold, finding food, protecting children, resting when possible, and moving again when the ground demanded it. To imagine that world carefully, we do not need to invent private thoughts for the people who lived near it or moved through it. We can begin with what is more reliable, the basic needs of a human animal. A body needs energy. It needs water. It needs warmth. It needs sleep. It needs social cooperation, especially when children are young and when weather, injury, hunger, or distance make life more difficult. In a low, changing landscape of rivers, marshes, open ground, and wet edges, those needs would have shaped every journey. The land beneath the North Sea matters because it once offered and limited the things bodies required. A dry rise was not only a feature of terrain, it could mean less dampness, less effort, a better place to pause, or a safer view across wet ground. A river was not only water. It could mean drinking, fishing, animals nearby, danger, delay, or a route that led the eye across the land. A marsh was not only an ecological zone. It could mean birds, plants, soft ground, insects, hidden footing, and slow movement. Every place had to be understood through the cost it placed on the body. This connects the drowned landscape to the deeper beginning of human life. Human beings did not first become human in libraries, cities, or marked territories. Our older inheritance was made through movement in environments where attention, endurance, memory, and cooperation were necessary. The brain and body worked together. A person remembered not only a direction but the effort of reaching it, the slope of a rise, the resistance of mud, the chill of wind near open water, and the relief of shelter could all become part of practical knowledge. In such a world, memory was not separate from sensation. It was carried in muscles, habits, and repeated routes. When a group crossed a landscape many times, the body learned where strength would be spent and where it might be saved. This was not romantic. It was physical. Wet clothing could drain warmth. Soft ground could exhaust legs. Cold wind could make stopping dangerous. Hunger could narrow attention. Carrying tools, food, fuel, or a child could change what distance meant. A place that looks small on a modern map could be large when crossed on foot under difficult conditions. A route that seems simple from above could become complicated when water spreads across low land. In Doggerland, as conditions shifted after the Ice Age, these physical realities would have changed along with the environment. A known path becoming wetter was not just a change in geography, it was a change in fatigue. A shoreline moving inland was not just a line moving on a future map. It was a change in where people could sleep, where they could cross, where they could find fresh water, and how much effort was needed to reach the next useful place. The body would have registered environmental change before any larger explanation could exist. This is why it is careful to speak not of sudden knowledge, but of repeated adjustment. People may not have known that a whole lowland world was being reduced over long spans of time, but they could know that a particular route had become harder, a familiar stopping place less reliable, or a wet crossing more dangerous than it had been before. Across generations, those local bodily experiences could reshape movement. Children growing up in a changed environment would not inherit the same landscape their elders had first learned. They would inherit a revised world, smaller in some directions, wetter in others, with new risks and different opportunities. This is one way a human country can disappear without a single final witness. It disappears through the body's changing relationship with place. What once felt reachable becomes tiring. What once felt familiar becomes uncertain. What once connected two regions becomes an edge that must be avoided, weighted beside, or crossed only under certain conditions. The story beneath the North Sea is therefore also a story of biological limits. Humans are adaptable, but they are not free from cold, hunger, water, fatigue, or danger. Adaptability does not mean every loss can be avoided. It means people can keep finding ways to live while the world around them changes, until some places no longer offer enough reason to return. Doggerland's disappearance was not only the drowning of landforms, it was the gradual removal of ground from the human body's usable world. The sea took paths before it took memory. It took resting places before it took names. It changed the distance between people and resources, between one generation's knowledge and the next generation's reality. And because so much early human history was held in movement rather than writing, the loss of usable ground also meant the loss of a form of memory that had no archive except the living body itself. The body does not measure a changing landscape in centuries. It measures it in steps, in warmth lost, in food found or missed, in the weight carried over difficult ground, and in the relief of reaching a place that can be trusted for one more night. In the drowned world beneath the North Sea, human life would have been shaped by these small physical measurements. A low plain crossed in clear weather might feel open and manageable. The same place after heavy rain, flood, thaw, or rising water could become slow, cold, and uncertain. A marsh does not need to be deep to change the meaning of distance. Soft ground takes strength from the legs. Wet feet can become dangerous in cold air. A detour around water can turn a familiar journey into a longer one. For people living without roads, maps, metal tools, or stored food in the later farming sense, these changes were not minor. They touched the basic economy of the body. Every movement had to return enough value to justify the energy spent. A place rich in fish, birds, plants, or animals might be worth the effort, but only if the body could reach it, use it, and leave it safely. This is why Doggerland was not simply land that happened to exist between Britain and Europe. It was a field of biological decisions. Where to walk, where to stop, where to gather, where to watch, where to avoid, where to return. The people who passed through that landscape were anatomically human, carrying the same broad needs that shape us still, but their world demanded a level of environmental attention that modern life often hides. Hunger was not an idea, it was a narrowing of strength. Cold was not only discomfort, it could threaten survival. Sleep was not merely rest, it depended on shelter, safety, warmth, and the group's ability to remain undisturbed long enough for bodies to recover. Children made these pressures even more serious, because a group's movement had to account for those who could not travel as quickly, carry as much, or endure the same exposure. The beginning of human history is often described through tools and migrations, but beneath those words is a quieter fact. Every tool and every movement was carried by a body that could tire, suffer, learn, and adapt. In a changing lowland, adaptation would have been constant. If water spread into a familiar route, people could choose another path. If a camp became too damp, they could move to higher ground. If animals shifted, people could follow or change what they looked for. But each adjustment had a cost. A new route had to be learned. A new stopping place had to be tested. A new pattern had to become reliable enough to be taught. Human knowledge is strong because it can be shared, but shared knowledge depends on a world that remains recognizable long enough for learning to work. In Doggerland, the rising sea slowly disturbed that relationship. The body could remember a path, but the path could become water. The elders could know a place, but the young might find that place changed, narrowed, or gone. This was not failure of memory. It was the world moving beyond the reach of old knowledge. The human brain is well suited to building maps from experience. It connects landmarks, smells, sounds, effort, danger, and reward into a sense of place. Yet such maps are practical, not eternal. They are updated by return. A group knows a crossing because people cross it again. They know a safe rise because it continues to hold them above wet ground. They know where animals pass because the animals still pass there often enough for the knowledge to matter. When rising water changes those patterns, the mental map has to bend. If it bends too often, some routes fall out of use. If a route falls out of use, the memory attached to it weakens. If the place itself disappears, the memory can no longer be tested by walking. In this way, the sea could slowly separate the human body from its own past. The land beneath the North Sea was not only lost as territory, it was lost as a training ground for attention, endurance, cooperation, and inherited skill. A person moving through wet margins had to sense risk without instruments. They had to know when a crossing was worth trying, when weather made waiting safer, when a distant group could be reached, and when the effort of travel would cost too much. These are not dramatic acts, but they are part of the deep foundation of our species. Human beings survived because they could join perception with memory, and memory with cooperation. One person's experience could guide another's body. One generation's hard lesson could protect the next. But environmental change can weaken that chain. A lesson tied to a vanished shoreline cannot guide feet that now face open water. A remembered camp beneath the sea cannot shelter anyone. A route that once connected people may become a boundary that makes meetings less frequent. This does not mean every change brought disaster. Humans are not passive before landscapes. They move, improvise, combine foods, alter tools, and learn new patterns. Still, the body places limits on every response. There is only so much cold it can tolerate, only so much hunger it can endure, only so much distance it can cover before rest becomes necessary. The disappearance of Doggerland can therefore be understood as the slow shrinking of a body's possible world. Not the shrinking of imagination, but of reachable ground. The sea changed what could be walked, what could be remembered through walking, and what could be passed on as useful knowledge. Beneath the North Sea, then, lies not only an old landscape, but an old relationship between biology and place. The lost country was once measured by breath, fatigue, warmth, thirst, caution, and return. Its disappearance reminds us that human history begins with bodies trying to continue in a world that is alive, generous, difficult, and never completely still. A human body does not need a permanent border to know when a world is becoming smaller. It feels the change in the routes that take longer, in the crossings that become less certain, in the places that no longer give shelter at the right moment, and in the distance between hunger and food. In the long transformation of the land beneath the North Sea, the shrinking of usable ground would have mattered first in these physical ways. A line of water moving across low country was not only a future coastline, it was a new demand placed on muscles, memory, and cooperation. People could turn aside, find another way, wait for better conditions, or move toward higher land, but each response required energy. Energy was the quiet currency of survival. To spend it poorly could mean weakness, exposure, or hunger later. To save it required knowledge of place, and knowledge of place required a world that remained stable enough to be learned. Doggerland, because it was low and changing, placed this old human balance under pressure. It offered rivers, wetlands, animals, plants, fish, birds, shelter, and movement. But the same water that made parts of it rich also made parts of it fragile. A place could be useful and unreliable at the same time. That is one reason the story should not be reduced to a simple image of people fleeing from a flood. The deeper human experience may have been slower and more ordinary, returning to a place and finding it altered, choosing a different crossing, avoiding ground that older people once used, learning a new route because the old one had become too costly. These changes may not sound dramatic, but for the body they are serious. A longer walk means more hunger. A wetter camp means more cold. A less predictable route means more risk for children, older people, and anyone injured or tired. A landscape that changes repeatedly asks the group to keep revising what it knows, and revision itself takes effort. This brings the drowned land back to the beginning of human life in a simple way. Before written memory, before maps, before permanent villages, human beings lived inside a moving relationship between body and environment. We survived because we could notice, remember, teach, and adjust. We could carry knowledge from one person to another. We could turn repeated experience into shared caution, but the knowledge was tied to land. It needed places where it could be practiced. A warning about a soft marsh, a memory of a dry rise, a habit of following a river bend, a seasonal expectation of animals near water. All of these depended on return. When return became impossible, the knowledge did not vanish in a single instant, but it lost its use. A remembered place under the sea becomes different from a remembered place on land. It can still live for a while in speech or habit, but it can no longer feed the body. It can no longer guide the feet. It can no longer teach a child through direct experience. In that sense, rising water changes memory by cutting it off from practice. The body is where this loss becomes real. We often speak about drowned landscapes, as if the main tragedy is that we cannot see them now. But for the people who live near them, The deeper loss would have been that the landscape slowly stopped answering human need. A crossing no longer crossed. A path no longer saved effort. A wetland became too wide. A distance became too great. A familiar direction led to water. This is how a country made of lived relationships can fade without leaving a written account. Its disappearance is recorded not in a final sentence, but in the gradual abandonment of use. The people who adjusted to these changes were not separate from nature, and they were not helpless before it. They were adaptable, observant, and socially intelligent. Yet adaptation always takes place inside limits. A human body can endure cold, but not endlessly. It can walk far, but not without food and rest. It can learn new routes, but only if safe routes remain. It can cooperate, but cooperation cannot turn open water back into dry ground. The shrinking of Doggerland therefore reminds us that human flexibility is real, but not magical. Our species is powerful because we can learn, but we are still creatures of water, temperature, calories, sleep and ground. The lost world beneath the North Sea sits exactly at that meeting point between intelligence and limitation. It was a place where human knowledge could grow because the land offered patterns. Then, over many generations, those patterns changed under the pressure of climate and sea level. The people inside that transformation may not have seen a single ending. They may have known only that some places were no longer worth the journey, some routes were no longer safe, and some memories belonged to ground that younger bodies could not reach. This is a quieter kind of loss than the fall of a city, but it reaches deeper into human history. Cities can be named after they fall. Their stones can remain. Their ruins can become warnings, symbols, or places of return. A prehistoric wetland, a river crossing, a hunting ground, or a dry rise beneath the sea leaves less for later memory to hold. Its value was in use, and when use ended, much of its human meaning ended with it. Doggerland asks us to respect that kind of meaning. It asks us to see the human past not only in monuments, but in the daily effort of bodies moving through a difficult world. Beneath the North Sea lies a lost geography of fatigue, warmth, hunger, skill, caution, and shared memory. It is not visible from the surface, but it belongs to the long story of what humans are. Animals who remember places, depend on one another, and build their lives on ground that may one day no longer be there. The evidence for a lost human landscape beneath the North Sea is not easy evidence. It does not wait on the surface in the form of standing walls, hearths, pathways, or villages ready to be uncovered by an ordinary excavation. Much of it lies underwater, buried beneath layers of sand, mud, and marine sediment, scattered by currents, disturbed by fishing, dredging, storms, and the long movement of the sea itself. This is why the archaeology of Doggerland is an archaeology of absence as much as presence. It is the study of what remains when the place that gave objects their meaning has been changed almost beyond recognition. On dry land, an archaeologist may find a tool where it was dropped, near a hearth, beside animal bones, within a layer that can be compared carefully to other layers. Context gives the object a voice. Under the North Sea, context is often harder to protect. A bone brought up in a fishing net may be real evidence, but the exact place it came from may be uncertain. A stone tool found in dredged material may show human activity, but not always the full setting of that activity. A buried river channel may reveal an ancient landscape, but it does not by itself show every person who crossed it. This difficulty does not make the evidence useless. It makes careful thinking necessary. The drowned world asks to be read through many small clues rather than one complete scene. Sediment cores can reveal changing environments. Pollen can suggest what kinds of plants grew nearby. Animal remains can show parts of the living community that once occupied the region. Seabed mapping can reveal old valleys, river systems, and surfaces shaped before the sea covered them. Stone tools can place human hands within the wider story. Together, these traces allow a cautious outline of a changing land, but they do not allow unlimited imagination. They do not permit us to name every group, describe every camp, or pretend that silence is the same as proof. This restraint is important because early human life was often light on the land. A group might stay briefly, move with the season, return when conditions were useful, and leave behind very little that could survive. Many of the things that mattered most would have been perishable. Wood, hide, plant fibres, food remains, spoken knowledge, gestures, warnings, and the memory of where to go. Even on dry land, such evidence can disappear. Beneath the sea, it is still more fragile. The North Sea did not only drown a landscape, it separated many traces from the human actions that once made them meaningful. A flint edge may survive, but the hand that shaped it is gone. A bone may survive, but the larger pattern of hunting, scavenging, or natural death may be difficult to reconstruct. A pollen record may show plants, but not the full human experience of moving through them. Archaeology in this setting therefore begins with humility. It accepts that the past is real even when it is incomplete. It accepts that ordinary lives can vanish more completely than monumental ones. This is deeply connected to the beginning of human history, because for most of our existence, people did not live in ways designed to be found later. They lived to continue. They used what was nearby, repaired what could be repaired, moved when they had to move, and taught what could not be written down. Their knowledge was practical and often invisible to the future. If a person knew the safest way through a marsh, that knowledge might save lives yet leave no object behind. If an older person remembered a dry rise above wet ground, that memory might guide a group, yet disappear when no one could walk there anymore. If children learned a route by following others, the learning happened in bodies, not in durable marks. Doggerland makes this problem larger because the land itself disappeared from ordinary human access. The archive was not destroyed completely, but it was transformed into a difficult archive. It became a seabed archive, one that must be approached with sonar, sampling, comparison, and patience. The absence of clear ruins should not be mistaken for absence of life. It may simply mean that the forms of life were not the kind that leave ruins, and that the environment later made the record harder to read. This is why a single object from the North Sea can feel so powerful. A worked stone, a preserved bone, a fragment from an old environment can open a small window into a world otherwise hidden, but the window remains small. The honest story must keep its scale. Doggerland was a broad prehistoric landscape, not a fully recoverable human diary. Its archaeology teaches us that much of the human past survives as probability, pattern, and trace, not as complete narrative. Beneath the water, the missing country is present through fragments and absent through everything those fragments cannot say. That mixture of presence and absence is not a failure of the story, it is the story. The sea has kept enough to show that an older world existed, and taken enough to remind us how easily the earliest human worlds can pass beyond memory. A fragment from a drowned landscape often carries two meanings at once. It is small enough to fit in a hand, and large enough to disturb the whole map. A stone tool found in material from the North Sea does not give us a complete human story, but it tells us that human hands belong somewhere in that older world. A bone from an animal does not show every season, but it reminds us that the seabed was once part of a living environment. A layer of sediment does not speak like a written page, but it can preserve the memory of fresh water, plants, marshes, or changing coastlines. The difficulty is that these traces rarely arrive in the perfect order that archaeologists would want. They may be found by fishing boats, dredging work, coastal erosion, or scientific sampling. They may come from layers disturbed by later water, or from deposits whose original setting is hard to fix. This creates a quiet problem. Evidence can be real and still be incomplete. A worked flint can show human activity, yet not tell us whether it was dropped during a brief visit, used near a camp, carried across a route, or moved from its first location by later processes. An animal bone can show that a species lived in the wider region, yet not prove exactly how humans interacted with it. A buried valley can show an old river system, yet not reveal every movement along its banks. Doggerland, therefore, asks for a kind of patience that is different from ordinary storytelling. It asks us to accept that the past may be visible only through edges. One edge is geological. The seabed holds forms shaped by water, ice, sediment, and time. Another edge is biological. Pollen, plant remains, and animal bones can suggest changing habitats. Another edge is human. Tools, cut marks when securely identified, and patterns of finds can suggest presence and behaviour. None of these edges alone gives the whole landscape, but together they begin to surround the missing world. They make an outline around absence, This is close to how much of early human history must be understood. The beginning of our story was not recorded by people who expected museums, archives, or viewers in a distant future. They lived inside immediate pressures. A tool was made because it was useful. A route was taken because it led somewhere important. A camp was used because the body needed rest, food, warmth, or safety. When people left, they did not leave a label explaining what the place meant. If the land later became sea, the silence deepened. The North Sea floor can preserve certain physical traces, but it cannot preserve the whole human relationship to a place. It cannot easily preserve the warning spoken to a child near soft mud, the gesture toward a dry rise, the knowledge of when birds returned, or the memory of a route that saved effort. These things were part of life, but they belonged to living bodies and spoken teaching. Once those bodies were gone and the ground was covered, the archive became uneven. This does not make the story weaker, it makes it more honest. A false version would fill every gap with certainty. A careful version lets the gaps remain, because the gaps themselves tell us something about deep time. They tell us that most human lives have always been more delicate than the evidence they leave behind. A stone edge may survive thousands of years, while the reason it was carried may vanish. A bone may remain, while the season of its death becomes uncertain. A river channel may be mapped, while the people who once recognized it as a path are lost beyond naming. The archaeology of Doggerland is therefore not a search for one dramatic object that explains everything. It is a slow gathering of many partial signals. Each signal must be tested against other signals. Does the sediment match a freshwater setting, a marine setting, or a changing margin? Does the pollen suggest open ground, wetland, woodland, or a mixture that changed over time? Does the shape of the seabed show an old valley, a shoreline, a basin, or a surface that might once have been exposed? Does a tool come from a context that can be trusted, or from material moved by water and machines? These questions may sound technical, but they are also deeply human, because they protect the past from being turned into a fantasy. They allow us to say what can be said, and stop where the evidence stops. In a sleep story about an entire country beneath the North Sea, that restraint matters. It keeps the lost land real. It reminds the listener that a hidden landscape does not need invented palaces to be meaningful. Its meaning lies in the fact that humans once lived in a world whose ordinary traces are now difficult to reach. The seabed keeps pieces of that world like quiet witnesses. Some witnesses speak of rivers, some speak of animals, some speak of plants, some speak of human hands. But many speak only through what is missing around them. To listen properly, we have to hear both the evidence and the silence. Beneath the North Sea, the past survives not as a complete memory, but as a careful pattern of fragments, each one asking us to imagine less wildly and understand more deeply. The deeper the evidence lies beneath water, the more important it becomes to remember what archaeology can and cannot do. It can recover fragments of old surfaces, read sediments, compare pollen, identify animal remains, map buried channels, and sometimes place a human-made object within a wider environmental picture. It can show that the North Sea floor was once something other than seafloor. It can show that landscapes changed, that rivers flowed where ships now pass, that wetlands and dry ground existed in arrangements no longer visible from the surface. But archaeology cannot restore every voice. It cannot bring back every route, every warning, every family connection, every remembered place, or every reason a person chose one direction instead of another. In Doggerland, this limitation is not a small detail, it is central to the story. The lost country beneath the North Sea was not lost only because water covered it. It was lost because the ordinary materials of its human life were fragile from the beginning. A stone tool could survive, a bone might survive, a layer of ancient mud might survive, but a spoken name, a teaching gesture, a seasonal habit, the memory of safe ground, or a careful instruction passed from an older person to a younger one would usually leave no durable trace. This means that the most important parts of early human life may be the hardest to recover. The first human worlds were made not only of objects, but of relationships between people and place. A river mattered because someone knew how to follow it. A dry rise mattered because someone knew it stayed safer when nearby ground became wet. A marsh mattered because someone understood both its resources and its dangers. If the physical place disappears, the relationship becomes hard for later people to see. The seabed may preserve the outline, but not the full human meaning. This is why Doggerland should be approached almost like a shadow cast by a vanished body. The shape is there, but the living presence that made the shape meaningful is gone. Scientists can study the shadow carefully. They can ask where the land was higher, where water flowed, where plants changed, where animals lived, and where humans left traces. They can build models, revise them, and compare new evidence with older interpretations. Yet the shadow remains incomplete, and honesty requires that we let it remain incomplete. There is a quiet dignity in that restraint. It protects the people of deep prehistory from being turned into characters in a story they did not leave behind. It allows them to remain real human beings rather than decorations for a mystery. The beginning of human history was not clean, permanent, or well documented. It was lived in weather, hunger, distance, and care. It was lived through bodies that had to cooperate, remember, and adapt. In a place like Doggerland, those bodies moved through a world that was useful because it was full of edges, and vulnerable because those edges could move. A river edge, a marsh edge, a woodland edge, a shore edge, all could offer food, shelter, or guidance. All could also change. The archaeological record captures some of those changes, but not the full experience of adjusting to them. A sediment core may show a transition from one environment to another, but it does not show the moment when a familiar crossing stopped being used. A mapped channel may reveal an old river, but it does not show the footsteps along its bank. The tool may show human skill, but it does not show the tired hand that held it at the end of a cold day. To tell this story well, the silence around the evidence must be treated as part of the evidence. Silence tells us that many human worlds did not leave monuments. Silence tells us that memory can be real and still disappear. Silence tells us that the visible map of the present is not the full map of human experience. When the sea covered Doggerland, it did not erase every physical trace, but it changed the conditions under which those traces could be understood. On land, objects can sometimes be connected to hearths, paths, camps, or repeated use. Underwater, many contexts become broken or difficult to confirm. The result is a record made of glimpses, a glimpse of environment, a glimpse of animal life, a glimpse of human presence, a glimpse of geological change. These glimpses do not form a complete picture, but they are enough to challenge the modern map. They remind us that the North Sea is not just a gap between countries. It is a covered landscape, a former living surface, a place where the oldest kinds of human knowledge may once have been practiced. That knowledge was not abstract. It was the knowledge of how to continue, where to go, when to wait, what to carry, how to share effort, how to bring children through difficult ground, how to remember a route while the world still allowed the route to exist. The archaeology of absence is therefore not empty. It is filled with careful limits. It teaches that a lost human landscape can be scientifically real without being completely knowable. It teaches that the past can be meaningful even when it refuses to become a full story. Beneath the North Sea, Doggerland remains partly present and partly unreachable, and that is exactly why it matters. It shows us that the earliest human past was not only buried in the ground. Sometimes it was buried by water, and sometimes what water preserves is only enough to let us know how much has gone. A shoreline can move so slowly that one lifetime may not feel like a catastrophe, and yet many lifetimes together can lose a world. This is one of the most important ways to understand the land beneath the North Sea. Doggerland was not simply there one day and gone the next. Some events may have been sudden and frightening in local places, but the larger disappearance of the low landscape belonged to a longer rhythm of rising seas, shifting water, and changing ground. For the people who lived through parts of that transformation, the loss may have appeared first as ordinary difficulty. A path became wetter, a camp was used less often, a crossing needed more care, a familiar route required a longer detour. A place where animals once gathered became less reliable. These changes could be serious without being understood as the end of an entire landscape. Human beings usually live inside the scale of their own days. They notice what affects food, safety, movement, children, and the next return. They do not always see the full shape of a change that takes centuries. In a low country of rivers, marshes, and shifting coasts, the difference between one generation and the next could be small enough to adapt to, yet large enough to accumulate. An older person might remember a drier route. A younger person might know the same direction as wet ground. A child might grow up learning a landscape already reduced from what earlier people had used. No one needed to stand on a hill and watch a whole country vanish in order for a country of memory and movement to be lost. The human beginning was built through such generational learning. Before writing, knowledge passed through bodies, voices, repeated journeys, and shared attention. A group knew a place because people had gone there before. A child learned a path by following others, by hearing warnings, by feeling fatigue in the legs, by noticing where adults slowed down or became alert. This kind of learning depends on continuity. It does not require the world to be perfectly still, but it does require enough stability for memory to remain useful. Doggerland's slow transformation placed pressure on that continuity. If the shoreline moved, the lesson had to move with it. If water spread through a valley, the old route had to be corrected. If a wetland widened, people had to decide whether the resources were still worth the effort. If higher ground became more important, the pattern of return changed. Across many generations, these corrections could quietly rewrite the human map. What had once been central might become marginal. What had once been easy might become costly. What had once connected groups might become a barrier. The population story should be treated carefully. We should not imagine a single crowd fleeing in one direction from a single flood unless evidence supports that exact image. It is safer to think of many small decisions made across time. Moving a camp, following animals elsewhere, staying closer to higher land, visiting some places less often, learning new edges of water, and gradually accepting that certain routes no longer belong to ordinary life. Such choices could change contact between groups. If a landscape that once allowed movement became broken by water, meetings might become less frequent or take different forms. Resources might be used differently. Knowledge might become more local. The later separation between Britain and the continent was not just a line drawn by water, it was a slow change in the possibilities of human contact. For people living during earlier phases, the land between these regions may have been part of a wider world of movement. As that land narrowed, flooded, and changed, the social geography would have changed too. We cannot name the families, count the groups, or describe their exact relationships. But we can understand the principle. When a landscape changes, the pattern of human generations changes with it. A child does not inherit only genes from older people. A child inherits roots, expectations, warnings, habits, and a sense of what lies in each direction. When the environment alters, that inheritance becomes unstable. Some knowledge remains useful. Some knowledge must be revised. Some knowledge becomes memory without practice. This is a quiet form of loss, because it may not announce itself. A place can disappear from daily life before it disappears from stories. A route can become too difficult before it becomes impossible. A remembered ground can become unreachable before it becomes completely forgotten. Beneath the North Sea lies this long, slow separation between generations and the places that once trained them. The sea did not only cover soil and river channels, it interrupted chains of learning that had connected people to ground. In that sense, Doggerland was lost not only when the last dry surface went underwater, but every time a younger generation could no longer use what an older generation remembered. That is how a world can vanish without a single ending, by becoming less reachable, less reliable, less teachable, until the living map has to turn away. A generation does not receive a landscape as an idea, it receives it through use. Older people show younger people where to walk, where to wait, where water can be crossed, where the wind is too strong, where animals may pass, where fuel can be found, and where a group can rest without losing too much warmth. In a stable world, these lessons can deepen. The same route walked many times becomes easier to remember. The same rise above wet ground becomes trusted. The same river bend becomes a place of return. But in a low and changing world like Doggerland, the lessons themselves may have had to keep changing. The land beneath the North Sea was not only lost in space, it was lost through the weakening of inherited knowledge. An elder might remember a place as open ground, while a child might know it as marsh. A parent might know a crossing that had become possible only in certain conditions. A young adult might decide that an older route cost too much energy to use. These are not dramatic scenes, but they are the ordinary way a human map can shrink. The ground does not need to disappear overnight. It only needs to become less dependable than memory says it should be. Human beings are social learners. Much of what we know about place comes not from discovering everything alone, but from receiving the experience of others. This is one of the deep strengths of our species. One person can learn from another person's danger. A child can avoid a bad crossing because someone older remembers what happened there. A group can move more safely because knowledge has been tested before. In the earliest human worlds, before writing and before fixed settlements in the later sense, this shared memory was a living archive. It existed in speech, gesture, habit, and repeated movement. Doggerland challenges that archive because the archive depended on a world that could still be reached. If a river changed course, a lesson about the old bank lost some of its force. If a wetland spread, a warning had to become wider. If a familiar dry place became too often damp, the group had to decide whether to keep returning or let it fall out of use. Across one lifetime, such changes might feel like practical problems. Across many lifetimes, they could become a transformation of identity, movement, and contact. A people who once knew a broad range of places might become tied more closely to remaining dry ground. A route that once connected distant groups could become a difficult edge. A meeting that once happened by walking might later require different timing, different skills, or may happen less often. The human story here is not only about individuals surviving the weather, it is about how generations inherit a world, then pass on a version of it that is already altered. This matters deeply for the idea of an entire country beneath the North Sea. A country of this older kind is not made from borders on a map. It is made from reliable relationships between people and place. Where can we go? Where can we return? What can older people teach that younger bodies can still practice? What lies beyond the next wet ground? What is worth the effort? These questions give shape to life. When rising seas and changing coasts made some answers less reliable, the country began to change even before it was fully drowned. In this sense, the loss of Doggerland may have been partly a loss of continuity, not complete forgetting all at once, but a gradual thinning of connection. A place might remain in memory after it stopped being useful. A route might remain in speech after it stopped being safe. A direction might still carry meaning after water had made it difficult. The beginning of human life was full of this tension between memory and change. We are animals that can remember the past, but we survive only by adjusting to the present. If memory becomes too old for the ground beneath the feet, the body must choose the ground. This is not a failure of culture. It is the condition of living inside nature. Doggerland's generations may have adapted again and again, moving with resources, following higher land, learning new water edges, and letting older patterns fade where they no longer served. The sea did not erase human flexibility. It revealed both its power and its limits. People could change routes, but they could not stop the long rise of water. They could keep children alive, but they could not keep every remembered place available to those children. They could carry stories, but stories could not make a drowned crossing walkable again. This quiet generational pressure is easy to miss because it leaves little direct evidence. Archaeology may show tools, bones, sediments, and submerged landforms, but it rarely shows the moment when a young person stopped learning an old path. It rarely shows the final time a camp was visited or the first time a group decided not to return. Yet, these invisible moments may be where much of the human meaning of Doggerland was lost. The sea covered the land slowly in many places, but before full coverage came a change in usefulness. A place can be gone from life before it is gone from the earth. It can stop shaping daily movement before it disappears beneath water. It can become a memory, then a distant memory, then no memory at all. Beneath the North Sea, the old landscape holds this layered silence. It suggests generations who did not simply witness loss, but lived inside adjustment. Each generation may have known enough to continue, yet not enough to preserve the whole older world. That is how a landscape becomes history without becoming legend. It changes the children's map, and then their children's map, until the sea that once approached slowly becomes the only map later people know. The slow loss of a landscape can be understood as a chain of small inheritances breaking. One generation receives a world from the one before it, but never receives it perfectly. The ground has shifted a little, the water has moved. A familiar route has become more difficult. A useful place has grown wetter, or farther away, or less safe to reach. In a land like Doggerland, where low plains, rivers, marshes and coastlines all change with climate and sea level, this quiet breakage could happen many times. No single person needed to see the whole story. A child might hear that older people once walked in a direction that now required caution. Later, that same child, grown older, might tell younger people about a place that had already become hard to reach. Still later, the younger people might know only the edge of that memory, not the ground itself. In this way, a human landscape can disappear first as practice, then as memory, and only afterward as a fact beneath the sea. The loss is not only geographical, it is generational. Human beings are born into worlds already explained by others. We learn what matters before we fully understand why it matters. We learn which ground is trusted, which water is dangerous, which direction leads to food, which weather makes movement unwise, which places belong to return, and which places belong to risk. In the earliest human past, this kind of knowledge was one of the main protections a group possessed. A tool could cut, a fire could warm, but knowledge of place told people where those tools and fires could be used safely. Doggerland, now hidden beneath the North Sea, was once part of that kind of knowledge. It may have linked groups, guided animals, offered wetlands and dry rises, and shaped patterns of movement that younger people learned from older ones. Yet as the sea rose and the land changed, the older knowledge could not remain unchanged. The teaching had to bend toward the new shoreline. The group had to follow the ground that still answered. A place that once stood near the center of movement might become an outer edge. A crossing might become a waiting place. A route might become a memory of a route. This is one reason we should be careful with the image of an entire country beneath the North Sea. It suggests something large, and the loss was large, but its largeness may have been felt through many small reductions. A hunting range narrowed, a wetland expanded, a dry passage became unreliable, a meeting route became rare, a shoreline moved into places where people had once expected ground. These changes could alter not only where people went, but who they met, what they taught, and how far their knowledge reached. When geography changes, social life changes quietly with it. Groups that once moved through connected terrain may have found distance increasing. Seasonal returns may have shifted. The known world of a child may have become smaller than the remembered world of an elder. We cannot name these people, and we should not pretend to know their personal griefs, beliefs, or spoken stories. But we can understand the human condition they belong to. They were members of a species that survives through shared memory, and shared memory needs places where it can be used. The beginning of human history was not a march toward permanence. It was a long practice of living with uncertainty. Humans learned to carry knowledge across time, but the earth did not promise that every place would remain available for that knowledge. Doggerland reveals this tension with unusual clarity. It was real enough to hold life, but vulnerable enough to vanish from the visible map. It could support memory for a while, but not forever. It could connect land masses for a time, but eventually the sea would make connection more difficult and then change it altogether. In that sense, the lost landscape was not simply drowned at the end. It was gradually removed from the chain of human teaching. The last time a route was used may not have been recognized as the last time. The final visit to a camp may not have carried any ceremony. A place might have been abandoned because another place was easier, drier, safer, or closer to food. Such decisions are ordinary, and because they are ordinary, they often leave no clear mark. Yet together, ordinary decisions can close an old world. A group survives by choosing what still works. Survival itself can require letting go. That may be the quietest truth in this story. The people connected to Doggerland were not failing when they adjusted. They were doing what humans have always done, reading the world, protecting the living, and moving toward conditions that allowed another day to continue. But every successful adjustment also may have carried a loss behind it. To choose a safer route is to leave another route unused. To settle attention on higher ground is to let lower places fade. To teach children the new edge of water is to admit, without needing to say it, that an older edge no longer matters in the same way. Beneath the North Sea, the lost country is therefore not only a buried landform, it is the remains of many altered inheritances. It is the place where memory, movement and environment slowly separated. And when later generations looked out over water, they may no longer have seen a disappearing homeland at all. They may have seen only the sea, as if it had always been there, while below it lay the ground that had once taught human bodies where to go. The story of Doggerland often gathers around one dramatic event, because the mind wants a clear ending. If a land lies beneath the North Sea, we want to know the moment when the water won. We want a final wave, a final shore, a last day that can hold the whole loss inside one image. There is a real event that seems to invite this kind of telling, a great submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, often linked to a powerful tsunami that affected parts of the North Atlantic and the North Sea region. It is known through geological evidence, and it was certainly large enough to matter in the history of coastlines. But the careful story must begin by resisting the easiest version. The Great Wave was not the whole explanation for Doggerland. It may have struck coastal areas, disturbed lives, and changed some low-lying places suddenly, but the wider drowning of the landscape was already part of a much longer process of rising seas after the Ice Age. To make one wave responsible for everything would turn a complex transformation into a simple legend. Doggerland deserves better than that. The land beneath the North Sea was not a stage waiting for one final disaster. It was a changing environment where water had been entering, reshaping, narrowing, and dividing human spaces over many generations. A tsunami, if it reached occupied places, would have been terrifying in local terms. Water moving with sudden force can destroy camps, scatter animals, contaminate fresh water, change shorelines, and make familiar ground dangerous in a matter of moments. Yet a sudden event can strike only the world that already exists. By the time such a wave occurred, the low landscape had already been reduced and altered by the long rise of the sea. Some areas may already have been wetlands, islands, coastal margins, or shallow marine zones. Some former routes may already have been gone. Some human knowledge may already have shifted toward higher and safer ground. This does not make the wave unimportant. It places it inside time. The human body would have known sudden water differently from slow water. Slow water changes habits. Sudden water shocks the senses. Slow water asks for adjustment across years and generations. Sudden water demands immediate survival. Both belong to the larger story of how humans live with a planet that moves beneath them and around them. In the deep beginning of human history, people did not control such forces. They read signs, remembered patterns, and responded as best they could. A storm surge, a flood, a river changing course, or a sudden wave would have been understood first through danger to bodies, where to run, whom to help, what to carry, what had been lost, whether fresh water remained, whether children and elders were safe, whether return was possible. We should not invent exact scenes that evidence cannot support, but we can understand the basic physical truth. Sudden environmental events compress decision into very little time. They reveal the limits of memory. A route known for years may fail in a single hour. A camp chosen for ordinary conditions may become unsafe under extraordinary water. A place that had been useful because it lay near a shore may become dangerous for the same reason. This is why the Great Wave matters as a warning against overly neat history. It shows that the past was shaped by both gradual processes and sudden interruptions, but it also shows why a single catastrophe cannot explain everything. The land beneath the North Sea had a long biography before any one wave. Ice had held water and then released it. Sea levels had risen. Coasts had migrated. Rivers and wetlands had changed. Generations had adjusted their routes and memories. The wave, if it entered that human world, entered a landscape already in transition. It may have accelerated abandonment in some places or made certain low areas less useful, but it did not create the entire submerged country from nothing. The temptation to make it the final answer comes from our love of clear endings. We understand a broken wall more easily than a slow shoreline. We remember a disaster more easily than centuries of adjustment. Yet the story of Doggerland asks for a slower kind of attention. It asks us to hold the sudden and the gradual together. A great wave can matter without being the sole cause. A long rise of the sea can be decisive without being dramatic in any single moment. Human loss can come from shock, and it can also come from repeated small changes that leave no obvious memorial. Beneath the North Sea, both possibilities meet. The seabed holds traces of deep environmental change, and the surrounding coasts carry evidence that water has not always respected the lines humans later imagine as stable. The people who lived near these changing edges would have faced a world where both memory and surprise were necessary. They needed knowledge of ordinary patterns, but ordinary patterns could be broken. They needed trust in familiar places, but familiar places could be changed by forces larger than any group. This is not a story about helplessness. It is a story about scale. Human beings are intelligent, adaptable, and social, but they are small beside ice sheets, sea level, landslides, and waves. The lost country beneath the North Sea reminds us that the earliest human worlds were held between skill and vulnerability. People could learn the land, but they could not make it permanent. They could survive many changes, but they could not prevent every place from becoming unreachable. The great wave stands in this story like a sharp sound inside a long silence. It may have marked some lives deeply. It may have changed some shores quickly. But the silence before and after it matters too. The long, slow movement of water over low ground. The gradual shrinking of roots. The quiet teaching of new shorelines to younger generations. To understand Doggerland honestly, we should not choose between slow drowning and sudden violence too quickly. We should let both remain in view, because human history often changes in more than one rhythm at once. A sudden wave can change a shoreline in a way that slow water cannot. Slow water teaches by repetition. It asks people to alter routes, move camps, test new edges, and accept that an older place has become less useful. A sudden wave arrives without that kind of teaching. It turns the known world into force. In the story of the North Sea, this difference matters because the land often called Doggerland was shaped by both kinds of water. The long rise of the sea after the Ice Age changed the region over many generations, but powerful events could have struck within that longer transformation. A tsunami linked to a major submarine landslide near Norway is one of those events. Its importance should be held carefully. It was not the beginning of the drowning, and it should not be treated as the single cause of the lost landscape. But it may have been a severe shock to some coastal and low-lying places already made vulnerable by rising seas. In human terms, that distinction is important. A landscape that is already shrinking can still be struck by disaster. A route that is already harder can become impossible. A marshy edge that is already uncertain can be flooded with sudden force. A camp that works under ordinary conditions may fail when water moves in a way no memory has prepared for. The human body would meet such an event first through urgency. There would be no time for broad explanation. The questions would be immediate. Where is higher ground? Who is near? What can be carried? What must be left? Whether fresh water remains? Whether return is safe? We should not invent a scene as if we had witnessed it, but we can speak about the pressures that sudden water places on any human group. It compresses choice. It breaks routine. It can separate people from tools, food, animals, and familiar ground. It can make a place emotionally and practically difficult to use again, even if some of the land remains afterward. For people living close to sea margins, this could matter deeply. The coastline is not just a line between land and water. It is a place where resources gather, where travel may be possible, where animals move, where fishing, gathering, and watching the environment can become part of life. But the same closeness to water that makes a coastal margin useful also exposes it to sudden change. That is one of the quiet paradoxes of Doggerland. Its low mixed environments may have supported life because they were rich in edges, yet those edges were precisely what could move, flood and fail. The beginning of human history was full of such dependence on unstable richness. People used what the earth offered, but what the earth offered could change without asking permission. A river mouth could give food and become dangerous. A wetland could attract life and slow escape. A shoreline could guide movement and then become the source of destruction. The great wave, placed inside this wider story, reminds us that adaptation is not always slow and peaceful. Sometimes the environment changes faster than knowledge can update. Older teachings might explain ordinary tides, storms, wet seasons, and safe crossings, but an exceptional wave could exceed those patterns. Human memory is powerful because it stores what has happened before. Its weakness is that it cannot fully prepare for what has not yet happened within living experience. This does not mean people were ignorant. It means they were human. They learned from the range of conditions their world had shown them. When the world stepped outside that range, survival depended on speed, luck, social response, and access to higher ground. Yet even after a sudden event, life would not simply stop. Survivors, if they were present in affected areas, would still have to decide where to go, how to replace what was lost, whether to return, and what to teach the young about the changed edge of water. A disaster can become part of memory, but memory after disaster is different. It may turn a familiar shore into a warning. It may make people avoid places that once seemed useful. It may shorten trust in low ground. It may accelerate a movement that rising seas had already encouraged. This is why a wave can matter without explaining everything. It can intensify a process. It can mark a turning point in certain places. It can make an already fragile landscape less habitable. But the deeper disappearance of Doggerland still belongs to the long conversation between ice, sea level, land height, rivers, sediment, climate, plants, animals, and human movement. The danger of a simple ending is that it gives the listener a false comfort. It says the country was there, then the wave came, then it was gone. The real story is less clean. Some areas may have been lost before, some may have remained after. Some may have changed from dry land into wetland, from wetland into coast, from coast into shallow sea. People may have adjusted many times before any sudden wave, and may have adjusted again afterward. The North Sea did not become what it is through one gesture. It became itself through many changes layered together. For sleep audio, there is something steadying in that truth. It does not rush the mind towards spectacle. It lets the sea become time, and time become a slow pressure on human life. The great wave is still there in the story, sharp and serious, but it is not allowed to swallow the whole past. Beneath it lies the longer loss. Generations learning new ground, then losing that ground. Roots becoming edges, then water. Memory trying to follow a shoreline that kept moving. An entire country can lie beneath the North Sea not because one wave created a legend, but because a long human landscape was made vulnerable first, then changed by both gradual water and sudden force, until later maps could show only the sea. The danger of a simple ending is that it can make the past feel easier than it was. A single wave gives the mind a clear image. Water rises, people flee, the land is lost, and the story closes. But the land beneath the North Sea does not fit so neatly into that shape. Its disappearance was not only a moment of sudden violence, and not only a slow background change too gentle to be felt. It belonged to both rhythms. There was the long rise of the sea after the Ice Age, changing shorelines across generations. There were also sudden events that could damage places already made fragile by that long change. To understand Doggerland honestly, we have to hold these rhythms together without forcing one to erase the other. A powerful wave could have struck low coastal areas with frightening speed, but it would have struck a world already altered by warming, melting ice, rising water, shifting rivers, spreading wetlands, and narrowing dry ground. A long process can prepare a landscape for disaster, and a sudden disaster can make a long process feel immediate. The human body would have known the difference clearly. Slow change appears as repeated inconvenience. A route wetter than before, a campsite less reliable, a detour that becomes normal, a shoreline remembered differently by older people. Sudden change arrives as danger without enough warning. Water where no body can stand. Familiar ground turned violent. Decisions compressed into breath and movement. Both forms of change matter because both reshape memory. Slow change asks memory to revise itself. Sudden change can break trust in memory altogether. A place known as useful may become feared. A low shore that once offered food may become a place to avoid. A route once passed down through teaching may be abandoned not only because it is covered, but because it no longer feels dependable within the living world of a group. This is where the Great Wave, if it touched human lives in the region, becomes meaningful without becoming the whole answer. It may have turned some margins into warnings. It may have pushed people away from certain low areas. It may have damaged freshwater sources, scattered animals, or changed the shape of a shore. But the country under the North Sea was already a country in retreat. If we understand country as a web of usable places rather than a state, its rivers, marshes, dry rises, and coastal edges had been shifting long before any one wave. The deeper loss came from the repeated breaking of connection between people and ground. In the beginning of human life, a landscape was not valuable because it was permanent. It was valuable because it could be known well enough to support another day, another season, another generation. Knowledge of place was a form of survival. Older people could guide younger people because the land still answered their memory. A dry place remained dry often enough. A crossing remained possible often enough. A river bend continued to lead somewhere, but when sea level rose and sudden events disturbed the margins, that relationship became less secure. The earth was not lying to human memory. It was simply changing faster or more deeply than memory could follow. That is why a simple ending would be unfair to the people and to the landscape. It would make them appear as figures caught in one dramatic scene, when their real world was probably made of many adjustments, many returns, many abandonments, and perhaps some shocks no one could prepare for. A group might survive a wave and still lose the place afterward because it no longer served life as before. Another group might never see such a wave, yet still lose old roots as the sea slowly advanced. Some losses are loud, some are almost silent. Doggerland reminds us that history can be shaped by both. Modern maps often hide this because they show the result, not the becoming. The North Sea appears as one blue space, calm and complete. It does not show the earlier wetlands, the exposed plains, the changing coasts, the places where water arrived gradually, or the places where it may have arrived with force. It does not show the human decisions made along those edges, to return, to wait, to leave, to teach a new route, to stop speaking of an old one because no child could use it anymore. Archaeology can recover some traces of the physical world, but these decisions are harder to see. They survive only as possibilities grounded in what we know about human dependence on land. We should be careful not to turn possibility into certainty, yet we should also be careful not to erase ordinary human experience simply because it left little behind. The lost country beneath the North Sea was not lost in the same way everywhere. Some places may have become water slowly. Some may have become dangerous suddenly. Some may have remained useful for a time after nearby ground had changed. Some may have passed from dry land to wetland to shore to seabed in stages that no single person saw from beginning to end. The result was a layered disappearance, not a clean closing door. That layered disappearance is more truthful than the image of one final flood. It allows the great wave to remain serious, but not absolute. It allows sea level rise to remain decisive, but not simplified into something too smooth to affect human lives. It allows the people of that world to remain human, observant, vulnerable, adaptable, and limited. They did not need to understand the planet's climate system to feel its consequences underfoot. They did not need to know the future North Sea to know that some places no longer worked as they once had. In the end, the danger of a simple ending is that it gives us an answer too quickly. Doggerland asks for a slower answer. It asks us to see a landscape weakened by long change, sometimes struck by sudden force, and gradually removed from the chain of human memory. Beneath the water is not one final day, but a long sequence of days in which the old country became less walkable, less teachable, less reachable, and finally invisible. When Britain became an island, it did not become one in the way a door closes. There was no single moment when all older connections vanished from human experience at once. The change was slower, more uneven, and more difficult to hold in the mind. The land between Britain and the continent had already been narrowing, flooding, breaking into wet edges, and losing usefulness across generations. What later maps would show as separation first appeared as changing ground. More water to cross, fewer dry routes, wider marshes, shifting coasts, and distances that asked more from the body. To people living inside those changes, the meaning of Britain's future island shape would not have been visible as a national fact. There was no Britain in the later political sense. There was no clear border drawn by law. There were people moving through landscapes, following resources, carrying memory, adjusting to what the ground and water allowed. The island was born first as a change in possibility. A route that once belonged to land became a route interrupted by water. A crossing that once required walking through difficult ground became something else entirely. A region that had once been part of a wider connected world became more separate, not because people decided it should be separate, but because the earth slowly redrew the conditions of movement. This is the quiet importance of Doggerland in world history. It helps us see that geography is not only the background to human events, geography can become an event itself, stretched over long time. The North Sea did not simply divide two places that had always been separate. It emerged across a landscape where connection had once been possible in different forms. As the sea expanded, it changed not only the outline of the land, but the ways people, animals, ideas, habits, and materials could move. We should be cautious here. It would be too simple to say that all contact ended when the land bridge was lost. Humans have crossed water for a very long time, and conditions, skills, and needs made that possible. Water can be a barrier, but it can also become a route for those who know how to move across it. Still, the loss of walkable land matters. Walking and crossing water are not the same kind of connection. Walking allows movement with children, tools, food, and repeated return in a way that is closely tied to the body and the memory of ground. Water crossings require different risks, different timing, different technologies, and different kinds of confidence. When a land connection becomes a sea crossing, human geography changes. The beginning of human life in northwestern Europe was shaped by that difference. For earlier people, the world that later became Britain and the world that later became mainland Europe may have been linked by landscapes of rivers, plains, wetlands, and shifting coasts. These links were not always easy, and they were not always present in the same way, but they offered forms of movement that the later sea would reduce. Animals could move through certain exposed areas. Human groups could follow changing resources. Knowledge could travel through repeated encounters. The loss of Doggerland changed the stage on which later history would unfold. It helped turn Britain into an island not only in a physical sense, but in the long imagination of later peoples who would look at water and think of separation. Yet the island identity came after the geological change. The sea came first. Names came later. Kingdoms came later. Written histories came much later. Under the North Sea lies the earlier condition, when the familiar island map had not yet fully formed. This is why the title's question leads beyond archaeology. An entire country beneath the North Sea means that the present political and cultural map is built on top of older vanished geographies. The island we recognise now rests beside a submerged past that once connected it to a larger land world. For the people who lived through the transition, the change would have been practical before it was symbolic. Where can we go? How far can we travel? Which direction still gives food? Which people can still be reached? Which places are no longer worth the effort? These questions shape social life quietly. If contact becomes harder, groups may meet less often or in different ways. If routes change, knowledge changes. If water grows between communities, the rhythm of exchange may slow, shift, or acquire new skills. Later history often remembers seas as borders between peoples, but in deep prehistory, that border was still being made. The North Sea was not yet the old fact it appears to be today. It was becoming, and as it became, human generations had to become different with it. A child born into a more separated landscape would not experience the loss in the same way as an elder who remembered wider ground. For the child, the sea might simply be the edge of the known world. For the elder, it might be the place where roots had changed, where stories pointed toward ground no longer reachable, where the shape of memory no longer matched the shape of land. This difference between generations is one of the quietest forms of historical change. The world can alter so much that what was lost for one generation becomes normal for the next. Britain's becoming an island belongs to that kind of change. It was not only a geological outcome, It was a transformation in how human beings could relate to space. Beneath the water, Doggerland remains, as a reminder that separation is not always original. Sometimes separation is made by time, by climate, by sea level, by the slow drowning of roots once held in the body. The island did not begin as an idea. It began as water entering the spaces where people and animals had once moved. The making of an island changes more than the outline of a coast. It changes the scale of ordinary life. When land connects two regions, movement can become part of a larger seasonal pattern. People may follow animals, search for useful stone, visit familiar places, meet others, or move away from pressure without needing to cross open water. The path may still be hard. It may pass through marsh, river, cold wind, and uncertain ground, but it remains a path for feet. When water enters that path, the meaning of distance changes. A space that once demanded endurance begins to demand another kind of skill. A journey that once depended on walking, memory, and bodily effort begins to depend on water conditions, crossing points, materials, weather, and risk. This is why the loss of the land beneath the North Sea matters so much for Britain's deeper past. It did not only cover ground, it altered the human grammar of connection. Before the sea widened, the world that would later be called Britain was not yet isolated in the way later history would imagine it. It belonged, at least during some earlier phases, to a wider northwestern European landscape. That landscape was not fixed, and not always easy to cross, but it allowed kinds of movement that later became harder. Animals moving through habitats did not recognize future national borders. Human groups living by hunting, gathering, fishing, and seasonal use of resources would have understood the world through places that worked, not through political edges. A river, a dry rise, a marsh edge, a valley, a shoreline, or a distant band of higher ground could matter more than any idea of island or continent. The disappearance of Doggerland slowly changed that older logic. It turned some directions into water. It made some meetings less simple. It transformed land-based memory into coastal memory. The sea became not merely an obstacle, but a new condition for how people could know one another across space. This does not mean separation was complete. Human beings are not stopped by water in every circumstance. Across the long human story, people have learned to use coasts, boats, rafts, tides, currents, and islands as routes. Water can connect as well as divide, but water connection is not the same as land connection. It asks for different knowledge, different confidence, and often different risk. A child can learn a walking route by repeated movement beside older people. A water crossing has more unstable elements: wind, waves, visibility, weather, materials, timing, and the danger of return being harder than departure. As the land connection faded, the world did not simply become smaller in every way, but it became differently organized. Some contacts may have continued, some may have weakened, some may have changed form. The important point is that geography had altered the terms under which human relationships could unfold. This is one of the reasons the North Sea should not be seen as empty space between histories. It helped create the conditions for later histories. Long before written kingdoms, long before Roman roads, long before medieval borders, the sea was shaping the field of movement. It was deciding, without intention, which routes remained easy, which became difficult, and which disappeared from common use. For early humans, such changes reached into the body and into memory. A group's world is not only the land it can see, it is the land it can reach, use, return from, and teach to the young. When reachable land shrinks or changes into water, the social world also changes. A person may know that something lies beyond the sea, but knowing is not the same as reaching. The distance across water can become a psychological distance as well as a physical one. Over time, later generations may begin to treat the sea as a natural edge, because they did not inherit the bodily memory of walking beyond it. What was once a changing loss becomes an ordinary horizon. That is how geography can enter culture long before anyone writes it down. The becoming of Britain as an island should therefore be understood as a long transformation of experience. The sea did not only surround land, it surrounded memory. It made the edge of the known world more visible, more permanent-looking, more powerful in the imagination. Later peoples would build stories, identities, defenses, routes, trades, and fears around that edge. But beneath those later meanings lies an older fact. The edge was made. It was not always where it is now. It arrived through warming climate, melting ice, rising water, and the gradual loss of low ground. Doggerland sits under the North Sea as evidence of that older arrangement. When the map of human possibility was wider in some directions and different from the one that shaped later history, this does not mean the vanished land determined everything that came afterward. History is never that simple. Climate, technology, population, culture, chance and choice all matter. But the physical disappearance of a land connection created a new framework. It changed how movement had to happen. It changed what kind of knowledge was needed to cross between regions. It changed the ease with which people, animals and materials could move across the old space. In the deepest sense, it changed the relationship between land and human time. The people of deep prehistory lived through a world still becoming the one we know. They did not stand at the beginning of Britain as an island and name it as such. They lived among roots, shores, wetlands, rivers and changing distances. Only later would the result seem obvious. Only later would the sea look as if it had always drawn the line. Beneath that line lies the hidden reminder that many boundaries begin as environmental changes before they become ideas. The North Sea made separation visible, but before separation became visible, it was a slow rearrangement of where human feet could go. The island that later people called Britain was not born from one clean separation, but from a long rearrangement of movement. By the time the North Sea had taken its familiar shape, an older world of roots had already been changed beyond recovery. The land, now hidden beneath the water, had once helped soften the distance between Western and Northern Europe. It offered, in different times and conditions, places where animals could move, where human groups could follow resources, where memory could travel through repeated journeys. When that land was reduced and finally lost, the connection did not disappear from the earth. It changed form. What had once been possible by walking became possible only through water, and that change carried consequences far beyond geography. A sea can be crossed, but it asks different things from the body and from the group. It asks for materials that float, knowledge of weather, judgment of waves, courage at departure, and confidence that return is possible. It also changes how often contact may happen, how many people can move together, what can be carried, and how easily children, tools, food, and older members of a group can travel. The making of an island, therefore, made a new human rhythm. It did not isolate every person completely, and it did not end all exchange, but it altered the terms of contact. This is why Doggerland matters to history, even though it left no written name. It stood for a time in the space where later people would imagine a natural sea border. Its disappearance helped create the conditions in which Britain would be experienced as a part. Long before that separateness became political, cultural or symbolic, it was physical. It was the feeling of water where ground had once allowed passage. It was the distance between known shores. It was the need to think differently about what lay beyond the horizon. The beginning of human history in this region was shaped by that physical change. People did not need to call a place an island for island conditions to begin affecting life. If movement became harder, contact patterns could shift. If contact shifted, knowledge could travel differently. If knowledge travelled differently, communities on either side of the water could develop under slightly different pressures, even while still remaining part of wider human worlds. We should be careful not to make the sea into an absolute wall. Seas often connect people who learn them well. Coasts can become corridors. Boats, rafts, tides, and shore knowledge can open routes where land has closed. Yet the loss of a broad walking landscape still mattered. It removed a kind of connection older than sailing, older than kingdoms, older than the stories later peoples would tell about island identity. Beneath the North Sea lies the memory of that earlier condition, when the edge between Britain and the continent had not yet hardened into the shape later maps would show. The story reaches beyond Doggerland because it shows how environmental change can become historical structure. A rise in sea level can become a change in migration, exchange, diet, language, fear, imagination and belonging, not in one simple step, but through many generations of altered possibility. A child born after the sea had widened would learn a different world from a child born when more ground remained. The later child might see water as an ancient fact, not as a recent arrival. In that quiet shift, a lost landscape becomes invisible. It no longer feels lost because no living body remembers walking it. This is how the present can hide the past without denying it. The North Sea looks permanent, but its permanence is only the surface of the latest map. Under that surface lies the older lesson. Human history is not only made by people moving across the earth, it is also made by the earth changing where people can move. Lost landscapes change human history because they remind us that the past is not limited to the places still visible. When we look at a modern map, land seems solid and water seems final. Countries have names. Coasts have outlines. Islands appear separate. Seas appear as old divisions. But beneath the North Sea lies a warning against trusting the present too completely. A large part of human life may have unfolded on ground that no longer appears as land at all. Doggerland matters because it shifts attention away from monuments and toward environments. It asks us to remember that the human story did not begin with walls, written records, cities or kingdoms. It began with bodies in landscapes, with people learning where to move, where to rest, where animals gathered, where water could be trusted, and where the ground would hold. A lost landscape changes history by changing the frame around human action. If we only study the land that remains dry, we may imagine ancient movement as more limited than it was. We may think Britain was always sharply separate from the continent. We may picture the North Sea as an empty gap rather than a covered archive. But if the seabed once held rivers, wetlands, dry rises, animal paths, and human movement, then the old map of possibility was different. People and animals could use spaces that later vanished. Routes could exist where later ships would pass. Familiar places could lie where modern eyes see only water. This does not mean we should invent certainty where evidence is incomplete. It means the absence of visible land is not the same as absence of history. For most of our species' existence, human beings lived in ways that left only light traces. A temporary camp, a stone tool, a cut bone, a path followed many times, a remembered crossing, a useful wetland, a place where children learned to move safely, all could matter deeply without becoming a ruin. The value of such places was practical before it was symbolic. They helped life continue. They trained memory. They shaped movement. They influenced who could meet whom, how far knowledge could travel, and what a generation could pass to the next. When a landscape like Doggerland disappeared, it removed more than land area. It removed an entire setting in which human decisions had once made sense. This is why lost landscapes are not empty footnotes to history. They are missing stages on which history already happened. The beginning of human life was not separate from climate and geography. It was entangled with them. Ice held water away from the oceans. Warming released it. Seas rose. Rivers shifted. Low ground became wet ground, then shore, then seabed. Plants changed. Animals changed. Human roots changed with them. The people living inside these changes did not need to know the whole planetary process to be affected by it. Their world changed through reachability. A place became farther. A route became harder. A crossing became unsafe. A remembered direction became water. These changes may seem small when seen from thousands of years away, but for a human body they could reshape life. Distance, hunger, cold, effort, and safety are the basic measurements of survival. A lost landscape changes history because it changes those measurements. It changes the possible range of a group. It changes the stability of teaching. It changes the meaning of memory. It changes the edge between connection and separation. Doggerland also changes the way we think about importance. Modern people often treat history as if it becomes meaningful only when it produces records. A named king feels more real than an unnamed group. A stone wall feels more convincing than a vanished river crossing. A written date seems stronger than a layer of mud. Yet the older human past was real before it was recorded. It was real in the care required to keep children alive. It was real in the skill needed to make tools, read weather, share food, and move through uncertain ground. It was real in the repeated return to places that no one would ever write down. The fact that the sea later covered those places does not make them less human. It makes them harder for us to honour. A buried landscape asks for a different kind of attention, one that respects ordinary life without demanding spectacle. It asks us to see that the foundations of human history are often quiet. A marsh edge can matter. A river bend can matter. A stretch of higher ground can matter. A path can matter, even if no trace of the walking remains. Under the North Sea, the lost country teaches that the earth has edited the human record. Some pages were preserved in caves, river terraces, bones, tools and sediments. Others were soaked, scattered, buried or drowned. What survives is not the whole story, but a selection shaped by geology as much as by human action. To understand our past honestly, we have to accept that some of the most important human landscapes are no longer available to sight. The present map is not a complete witness. It is only the latest surface above deeper time. A lost landscape also changes human history by changing what later generations believe is natural. When a coastline has existed for longer than memory can reach, it begins to feel permanent. People build stories, identities, trade routes, fears, defences and habits around the visible edge of the sea. The water becomes part of how they understand themselves and others. But Doggerland reminds us that what feels natural to one age may be the result of deep change in an earlier age. The North Sea looks like an ancient divider because human memory is short beside geological time. Beneath it lies evidence that separation was made slowly, not given from the beginning. This matters because humans often explain the past by starting with the present map. We imagine people moving within borders that did not yet exist, across seas that had not yet fully formed, toward islands whose islandness was still becoming. A vanished landscape interrupts that habit. It asks us to begin again from an older arrangement of land and water, where the possibilities of movement, contact and survival were different. In that older arrangement, the world was not organized around the names we know now. It was organized around reach. What could be reached on foot? What could be crossed safely? What could feed a group in one season and fail in another? What could be taught to children because it remained true often enough? The history of Doggerland is therefore not only about land that disappeared, it is about the disappearance of a whole set of possible human relationships. If ground connects two regions, people may meet in one way. If water separates them, they may meet in another way, less often, with more preparation or through different skills. If a wetland expands, a group may change how it moves. If a river mouth shifts, the useful places around it may change. If a low plain becomes seabed, the map of ordinary life is rewritten. These changes do not always leave visible ruins, yet they can shape the direction of later history as strongly as a wall or a road. The beginning of human history was built on such invisible foundations. It was built from the practical relation between bodies and environments. People could only carry culture through the world if their bodies could survive the journey. They could only share knowledge if routes and meetings allowed it. They could only inherit a place if the place remained available long enough for inheritance to work. When a landscape vanishes, some cultural possibilities vanish with it, while others emerge elsewhere. This does not mean the lost land determined everything. Human history is never one cause moving alone. Climate, tools, food, population, chance, learning, and social life all interact, but the physical world sets conditions. It opens some paths and closes others. It makes certain decisions easier, others more dangerous, and others impossible. Doggerland shows this with unusual clarity because its disappearance transformed a broad zone of possible movement into a sea. The change was not only local, it helped create the geography in which later Northern European history would unfold. Britain's later separation, coastal life around the North Sea, changing routes of movement, and the idea of the sea as an edge all rest partly on this older transformation. Yet the deepest lesson is not about one region alone. It is about the fragility of the human record. Many early landscapes were coastal, riverine, or low-lying because such places often offered water, food, animals, plants, and movement. These are also places that can be altered or drowned when sea levels change. If we only study what remains above water, we risk mistaking survival of evidence for importance. A high dry cave may preserve more than a low wet plain, but that does not mean the cave was the only meaningful place. A stone tool on land may be easier to study than a submerged surface, but that does not mean the submerged surface held no human life. The record is uneven, and the unevenness can mislead us if we forget how much has been lost. Doggerland is a reminder that absence can be produced by nature, not by lack of human presence. The sea covers, sediment buries, currents move objects, organic materials decay. Context breaks apart. Later people inherit a map that hides all of this, and then they may begin to think the hidden world was never central. A careful history must resist that mistake. It must treat the present coastline as evidence, but not as a boundary of imagination. It must allow for old routes underwater, old habitats under shipping lanes, old memories that died before writing could protect them. This changes the emotional scale of human history. It makes the past less like a straight path toward the modern world, and more like a series of lives unfolding inside landscapes that were themselves changing. Human beings adapted again and again, but adaptation did not preserve every place. Survival often meant leaving something behind. A group that moved to safer ground might keep living, but the old ground could fade from practice. A generation that learned the new shore might thrive, but the older inland route under the water would no longer train young bodies. In this way, the story of Doggerland is not only about loss, it is about the price of continuity. Humans continued, but not every human world continued with them. Some worlds were carried forward in altered form, some were abandoned, some were drowned so fully that only science can now give them a careful outline. Beneath the North Sea, the Lost Country teaches that human history is not only made from what our ancestors built, it is also made from what the earth allowed them to reach, and from what the earth later took beyond reach. The lesson of a lost landscape is that human history is larger than human memory. Memory follows what remains usable, visible, and named. It clings to shorelines that can still be walked, rivers that still flow above ground, hills that still rise into view, and ruins that still interrupt the surface of the world. But Doggerland belongs to another kind of past. It belongs to the part of human history that was real enough to shape lives, yet fragile enough to disappear almost completely from ordinary sight. Beneath the North Sea, the land did not preserve itself as a monument. It became seabed, its rivers were buried, its low rises were covered, its wetlands and paths were folded into sediment and water. Later generations inherited the result, not the process. They saw the sea and thought of it as a boundary, while below it lay an older geography that had once made other kinds of movement possible. This is why lost landscapes change human history. They do not simply add missing land to an old map, they change the questions we ask. Instead of asking only where people built, we have to ask where people moved. Instead of asking only what they left behind, we have to ask what kinds of places made leaving anything behind unlikely. Instead of asking only how societies formed on dry land, we have to ask how much of early human life unfolded along coasts, river mouths, wetlands, and low plains that later became difficult or impossible to study. The beginning of human life was not centered on permanence. It was centered on continuation. People needed food, warmth, water, tools, safety, rest, and one another. They needed places that could be learned and returned to, even if those places held no stone walls and no written names. A river crossing might support generations of movement without ever becoming a monument. A dry rise near wet ground might help people rest, watch, or stay above danger without leaving a clear sign for the future. A shoreline might guide travel and offer resources, then move so far that the old meaning of the place was lost. The human record is therefore not only incomplete because people failed to record it, it is incomplete because the earth changed the places where life had been recorded in use. This gives Doggerland a quiet importance. It reminds us that absence must be interpreted carefully. No visible ruins beneath the waves does not mean no human importance. No written name does not mean no memory once existed. No clear settlement pattern does not mean people did not know the land. It may mean that the kind of life lived there was mobile, practical, seasonal, and lightly marked. It may mean that water, sediment, and time have made the remaining signs difficult to connect. It may mean that the most meaningful parts of that world were never durable enough to survive. The spoken warning, the repeated route, the shared meal, the remembered crossing, the gesture towards safer ground, the knowledge that one place could be trusted and another could not. These were not small things to the people who depended on them. They were part of the deep human inheritance. We are a species that survives by turning experience into shared knowledge. but shared knowledge needs a world where it can still be practiced. When a landscape disappears, some knowledge loses its ground. A child cannot learn a drowned path by walking it. A group cannot return to a camp under the sea. A memory of useful land becomes weaker when no living body can test it. In this way, Doggerland shows that environmental change does not only affect resources or routes, it affects the bond between generations. It changes what older people can teach and what younger people can confirm. It changes the shape of belonging before anyone writes the word belonging down. The lost land beneath the North Sea also teaches humility about the present. The map we know feels complete because it is the map we live with, but it is not the final truth of the Earth. It is a current arrangement, one surface in a long sequence of surfaces. Ice ages, warming periods, rivers, storms, sediments and seas have all written over older worlds. Human beings have always lived within that movement, never outside it. We can adapt, but adaptation does not mean nothing is lost. Sometimes survival carries people forward while places fall behind. Sometimes a generation continues because it accepts a new route, a new shore, a new limit, and in doing so lets an older landscape pass out of use. Doggerland asks us to value that hidden cost. It asks us to see history not only as a rise towards cities and records, but as a long relationship between human life and changing ground. Under the North Sea, the old country has no flag, no capital, and no preserved voice of its own. Yet it still teaches something steady and useful. The foundations of human history were laid in places that could vanish. A landscape does not need to last forever to matter. It only needs to have shaped movement, memory, learning, and survival while people were there. And if the sea can cover such a world so completely, then every present shoreline may be less like an ending than a pause in a much longer story. The sea keeps some things and removes others. It can preserve a bone in sediment while taking away the world that gave the bone meaning. It can cover an old river channel, yet leave its shape faintly visible to instruments. It can hide a landscape so well that later generations forget to ask whether land was ever there. Beneath the North Sea, Doggerland remains in this double state, partly kept, partly taken. Enough is kept to show that the present sea was not always sea. Enough is taken to prevent us from turning the vanished world into a complete human story. This is why the final movement of the journey should be careful and quiet. The old land does not teach by giving us a dramatic answer. It teaches by changing the way we look at what seems stable. A coastline is not a promise. A map is not a final truth. A sea may be a recent face over an older ground. For the people who once lived near or within that changing region, the world was not an object to be preserved for us. It was a place to move through, to learn, to use, to fear, to trust, and to revise. Their lives belonged to days, seasons, bodies, children, weather, hunger, fatigue, and return. They did not leave us a written explanation of what was lost when the water advanced. They left at most fragments, stone shaped by hand, animal remains, traces in mud, pollen, buried valleys, and the silence around them. That silence is not empty. It is a reminder that human history began long before humans could protect memory with writing. In the deepest sense, our beginnings were not placed in permanent monuments. They were placed in relationships with land. A group knew where to go because the land had taught them. A child learned safety because older people knew which ground could be trusted. A route mattered because it could be walked again. A river mattered because it could guide movement, hold life, and mark return. When such places vanished, the knowledge tied to them had to change or fade. The sea did not only cover soil, it covered the practice of knowing that soil. It covered the places where memory had been tested by footsteps. That is why Doggerland is more than a curiosity beneath the North Sea. It is a lesson in humility. It tells us that the human story is not fully visible from the land that remains. It also tells us that the Earth has always been active in the making of history. Ice, warming, water, sediment, storms, rivers, plants and animals were never a background separate from people. They were part of the conditions through which people became who they were. Human beings are often described by our tools, our language, our imagination, and our ability to cooperate. All of that is true, but those abilities were formed inside places that placed limits on them. A tool is useful only if the body can carry it where it is needed. A memory is useful only if the world still allows it to be practiced. Cooperation is powerful, but it cannot stop a rising sea from changing the ground. The lost country beneath the North Sea, therefore, teaches a calm and serious truth. Human life is adaptable, but it is never independent from the earth. The people of deep prehistory were not weak because they could not preserve every place. They were human because they adjusted, moved, learned, and continued where continuation was possible. Yet continuation always has a cost. To move towards safer ground is to leave some older ground behind. To teach a new route is to let an older route fall silent. To accept a new shoreline is to live with the fact that the previous one may no longer answer. Over many generations, this kind of acceptance can erase a landscape from daily life before it is erased from memory, and from memory before it is erased from the earth. Later, when the sea has covered everything, the loss becomes almost invisible. The water looks calm, the map looks complete, the old world seems impossible because no one alive remembers standing there. But science, carefully and slowly, has reopened a small window. It does not give us the whole room. It does not return the voices. It does not restore the paths. It only shows that under the water lies a former surface of life, and that surface once belonged to the long story of human movement. This is the value of looking beneath the North Sea. It does not make the past stranger than it was. It makes the present less certain than it feels. The sea teaches that what is ordinary now may be temporary in deeper time. It teaches that some of the most important human places may leave no monuments at all, and it teaches that loss can be slow enough to become normal while it is happening. The lesson of Doggerland is not only that land can disappear, it is that human certainty can outlive the ground that first created it. People learn the world through repetition. A shore is walked many times, so it becomes familiar. A river is crossed many times, so it becomes trusted. A place gives food often enough, so it becomes part of expectation. Then, if the world changes slowly, expectation may continue for a while after the place has begun to fail. This is not only a prehistoric problem, it is a human problem. We build confidence from what has repeated before, but the earth does not promise endless repetition. Beneath the North Sea lies a reminder that the present is always younger than it appears. The water looks ancient because it is what we know now, but under it are older surfaces, older rivers, older edges between dry and wet, older paths of animals and possibly people, all belonging to a time when the shape of northwestern Europe was different. This does not make the modern sea false. It makes it layered. It is both a real sea and the cover over a former land. It divides Britain from the continent today, while also hiding evidence that this division was made through time. A coastline, then, is not just a line where land ends. It is a temporary agreement between water, climate, sediment, and land height. Human beings live inside that agreement, often forgetting that it can be revised. The people of the lost landscape did not need to think in these terms. They lived by nearer truths. Is the ground dry enough? Is there fresh water? Is the wind dangerous? Are animals near? Can children keep moving? Is this place still worth returning to? These questions may sound simple, but they are close to the foundation of our species. Before humans built states, we built familiarity. Before we wrote history, we depended on memory. Before we named countries, we knew places by how they held the body. Doggerland teaches that such knowledge is powerful, but also vulnerable. If the place remains, knowledge can deepen. If the place changes, knowledge must change. If the place vanishes, knowledge loses the ground that kept it alive. There is a quiet educational value in this. It asks us to treat the environment not as a background, but as one of the makers of history. The disappearance of Doggerland did not require human fault, punishment, or mystery. It followed large natural processes after the Ice Age. Warming climate, melting ice, rising seas, changing rivers, shifting coasts, and occasional sudden events that could strike already fragile margins. These processes were not aimed at human beings, yet human beings had to live with their consequences. That is still one of the most basic truths about our place on Earth. We are intelligent enough to remember, imagine, and explain, but we are still creatures of ground, water, temperature, food, and time. Our ancestors adapted because adaptation was necessary, not because it was easy. They adjusted routes, followed resources, learned new edges, and continued where continuation was possible. But the fact that humans continued does not mean nothing was lost. A living world can survive by leaving places behind. A generation can protect its children by teaching a new path, while an older path fades. A group can move towards safer ground, while a remembered lowland becomes less reachable, then unreachable, then unknown. In this way, Doggerland gives the listener a calmer, more honest sense of loss. It is not the loud loss of a palace falling. It is the quiet loss of places that once helped ordinary life continue. The sea now keeps them beyond sight, and what remains is a patient question about how much human history lies outside the maps we usually trust. Perhaps the most useful lesson is humility. We should not demand that the past become clearer than the evidence allows. We should not fill the North Sea with invented cities or certain stories where only traces remain. But we should also not mistake silence for emptiness. The absence of a written name does not mean the absence of human meaning. The absence of standing ruins does not mean the absence of lived experience. The absence of a visible landscape does not mean it never shaped movement, memory, and survival. Doggerland matters because it asks us to respect what cannot fully return. It asks us to imagine carefully, not wildly. It asks us to understand that the earliest human story was not protected by stone and ink, but carried in bodies moving across changeable ground. Under the North Sea, that ground is hidden, yet it still teaches. It teaches that human beings belong to landscapes more deeply than maps can show. It teaches that what seems permanent may be only the latest pause in a longer transformation. And it teaches that the value of a place is not measured by whether it lasts forever, but by whether it once helped life, memory, and learning continue. The final lesson beneath the North Sea is not that the world is fragile in a frightening way, but that it is older, slower, and less fixed than human memory wants it to be. A person can stand on a modern shore and feel that the water has always been there, that the island has always been an island, that the map has reached its finished form. Yet under that water lies another truth. The shape of the earth has changed around human beings for as long as human beings have existed. Ice has grown and retreated. Rivers have found new paths. Forests have advanced and withdrawn. Coasts have moved. Seas have entered low ground and made familiar places unreachable. Doggerland is one example, but it is a powerful one because it sits beneath one of the most familiar seas in Europe, hidden not in legend, but in sediment. Drowned channels, animal remains, plant traces, and rare signs of human presence. It reminds us that the visible world is only the upper layer of a longer story. The people connected to that lost landscape did not leave us a message explaining what it meant to them. They did not tell us when a route became too wet, when a camp was no longer used, when a shoreline began to feel unsafe, or when a child first learned a smaller world than the one remembered by elders. We cannot restore those moments with certainty, and we should not pretend that we can, but we can understand the human condition around them. They lived in bodies that needed warmth, food, water, rest, and one another. They lived by memory, attention, and adjustment. They belonged to landscapes not as owners with borders, but as living beings whose survival depended on knowing where to go and when to turn back. That is where the value of this story becomes clear. It does not ask us to admire a lost civilization. It asks us to respect ordinary human life before written history. It asks us to see that a river crossing, a dry rise, a marsh edge, a place of return, or a route taught across generations could matter as much to survival as any monument mattered to later memory. The sea has hidden much of that ordinary importance. It has covered the ground where bodies learned, where knowledge was shared, where hunger and caution shaped decisions, where the earliest forms of human history were lived without being written. Yet the sea has not made that history meaningless. It has made it quieter. It has made it harder to recover, and perhaps more necessary to approach with care. The lost country beneath the North Sea was not a nation in the modern sense. It had no flag, no capital, no preserved law, no known names spoken by its own people. But it was a country in an older and deeper sense, a region of lived relationships between humans, animals, water, weather, ground, memory and time. Its disappearance teaches that human history is not only the story of what we build, it is also the story of what we depend on, what we adapt to, and what we lose while continuing to live. Survival can carry a species forward, but it does not carry every place forward. Some landscapes fall behind. Some routes are no longer walked. Some memories lose the ground that once made them useful. Some worlds become so covered by the present that they seem never to have existed at all. Doggerland gives us a calm warning against that forgetfulness. It teaches that absence is not emptiness. It teaches that silence is not proof that nothing happened. It teaches that the earth itself has shaped the human record, preserving some traces while taking away the settings that would have explained them. And it leaves us with a quieter way to look at the sea. The North Sea is not only water between countries, it is a surface above older ground, a present shape above past movement, a calm cover over a landscape where human life may once have followed rivers, animals, seasons, and shorelines now lost from sight. To listen to that hidden world is to understand that our own map is also temporary, and that human beings have always lived between memory and change. So when we look across the water and see only the horizon, what other human worlds may still lie beneath the places we have learned to call empty?